Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Members may remove their jackets if they wish to do so. And can I reiterate the instruction, and you'll note it's an instruction, not a request, that members address through the chair and that you do not, therefore, use the expression you when speaking. I understand we had a slight problem with that this morning. Amendment 34 to Clause 1 has been moved, and at the adjournment, Mr. Kruger had the floor. Danny Kruger.
Very grateful. Sir Roger. So before the break, the Honourable Lady for Penistone Stocksbridge was giving a very helpful account of the operation of the Mental Capacity Act, with reference particularly to best interests and the concept of best interest that applies in the MCA. And she was explaining that the best interest consideration only kicks in once the capacity test has been failed, once somebody's concluded that they're incapacitous, once it's been concluded that someone does not have capacity, and therefore there would be no best interest consideration in the case of assisted dying. Either they have capacity, and that's that, the rather low bar, as we've discussed, appropriate for buying a cup of coffee, is got over, and they're off to the Assisted Dying Commission or whatever process it is that we eventually try and set up. Or they don't have capacity, and then they're as it were, ejected from the system, and there's no best interest consideration. And I reference this, Mr. Chairman, because my whole point is that this bill doesn't use the Mental Capacity Act. It just uses the definition of capacity that's in it, and that definition is very weak. It is designed to assume capacity in the patient, and it can, as we've discussed earlier today, it can include somebody who has impaired judgment. They could be depressed, they could even be suicidal. And indeed, my honourable friend for Solihull very honestly said earlier that he'd be content. He'd be content with somebody who had depression accessing assisted suicide. That would be possible under the Act. Because the point is that once this test of capacity has been passed, there is no best interest consideration. And it's a great, I think, abuse of the Mental Capacity Act, which was designed, its whole purpose is concern for the vulnerable. But that purpose is ignored once the usefulness of the Act has been fulfilled. And I think the bill does violence to the Mental Capacity Act in using it for this purpose. The fact is the Mental Capacity Act was designed for the opposite situation. It's designed to protect people from having things done to them. And this brings me, I'll conclude shortly, Sir Roger, this brings me to the point that we've been discussing at length already today, this crucial question about whether the decision to have an assisted death is different from the decision to decline or to cease treatment. And let me start by pointing out that case law specifies that to decline treatment is not to commit suicide. And I recognise my honourable lady doesn't like the term suicide, and I apologise, but I'm using legal terms here. The fact is, there is a distinction in law between the act of suicide and the decision to decline treatment. And I refer particularly to the famous Tony Bland case in 1993, and quoting Lord Gough in the House of Lords, who said that in cases of this kind, there is no question of the patient having committed suicide, nor therefore of the doctor having aided or abetted him in doing so. It's simply that the patient has, as he is entitled to, declined to consent to treatment which might or would have the effect of prolonging his life, and the doctor has, in accordance with his duty, complied with his patient's wishes. I also quote Sir Thomas Bingham, as he then was, who said, in the case of the Tony Bland case, it was plainly not suicide. And he said this: it was not the discontinuance of artificial feeding, but the patient's condition and its underlying cause which caused his death. So in the withdrawal of treatment, it's not the act of withdrawing treatment that kills you. It's your disease, it's the condition you have. Whereas in assisted suicide, it is the act that kills you. That is a crucial distinction. And the distinction is apparent. We heard it this morning in remarks from my honourable friend for Solihull, my right honourable friend for North West Hampshire, and I think the honourable lady for Spend Valley as well, pointing out that there is a difference between these two cases as evident with respect to advanced directives, which do allow for a withdrawal of treatment. They do not allow for the active administration of treatment. They allow for the withdrawal of treatment. They certainly don't allow they wouldn't allow for assisted dying, as the Honourable Lady accurately said. And so this goes to the heart of it, Sir Roger. There is a difference between being left alone and demanding that something is done to you. The state protects your right to be left alone. It doesn't yet give you a right to have something done to you simply because you ask for it. Happy to give way.
With regards to the proposals in this bill that we're considering today, it is not about someone doing something to someone. It is about self-administration of someone being able to do something to themselves. And the point is about choice to do that.
I recognise that, and I recognise, thank you, Roger, I do recognise that the bill distinguishes between euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, in which it would be a case of the doctor doing it to you, and the bill specifies that the drugs must be self-administered. By the way, that's a distinction I don't understand the logic of, but I recognise that there is an attempt in order, I think, to maintain to make the bill more palatable. That distinction has been preserved. Nevertheless, what is being done and would be enabled under the bill is for a doctor to prescribe lethal drugs with the purpose of you ending your life. So that is an act that is being performed. You're being prescribed drugs for the purpose of ending your life. If you actually had to, take the pills yourself or press the syringe yourself, nevertheless, the act has been performed. It is the act of the drugs that have been prescribed which kill you.
I'm grateful to him. He will recall in evidence from Professor Hoyano that she said that she couldn't legally see the distinction between a doctor handing the pills to somebody to take themselves and the doctor pulling the plug out of the wall to turn off the ventilator or whatever machine might be keeping the person alive. Both of them are an act by a doctor at the request of the patient to foreshorten their death and avoid whatever they contemplate at the end of their death. I realise we're dealing with possibly semantics here. We might have an irreconcilable difference about this act, but I have to say, from the point of view of a patient, from the person who is approaching their death, those two acts, in my view, seem to be broadly the same. In both circumstances, I am requesting that a doctor do something to hasten my death, because I do not wish to continue living in the circumstances that are presented to me.
Well, my right honourable friend absolutely articulates the point very well. I don't think it's a semantic decision. I think it's a real distinction. The fact is that unplugging the ventilator leads to death, but what kills the patient is not the administration of any treatment or drugs that have been provided. The patient then dies naturally, whereas the administration of drugs that are designed to kill you is a qualitatively different event. And I agree with him that, of course, the ultimate effect is the same, but the act that is being performed is qualitatively different, and indeed the intention of the doctor is different.
Forgive me, but surely the whole point of what we're trying to do here is to give people the opportunity to avoid the natural death that is being presented to them. What we hear again and again, certainly heard from the families who gave evidence, Roger, is that they profoundly wish to avoid their natural end because it was going to be degrading and unpleasant and profoundly painful on every level. And that's the whole purpose of the Act. So to say that somehow we should avoid that issue seems to me to negate our whole reason for being here.
Well, we're trying to avoid suffering, pain, bad deaths. That is what we all share a view on. And indeed, I think in the next group there are amendments, or later in this clause there are amendments which we will be debating, which will look explicitly at this issue of the purpose of an assisted death and the question of the avoidance of pain. I'm simply making the important distinction between the decision to withdraw treatment and the decision to administer fatal drugs, which, as I'm saying, are qualitatively different in principle and different in practice. Happen to give way.
I think to build on that point that my honourable friend made, I think this is the heart of the issue, isn't it? I think you're right. They are slightly different things. Sorry, Chair. I think the honourable member is correct. And I guess it gets to the heart of the issue as to whether we think this is the right thing to do or not. And I think the Bill Committee's job is to put that decision back to the House That's not for us to decide here today. It's for us to have the discussion around how we can improve the bill and send it back to the House. But he's absolutely, the Honourable Member's absolutely right to say that this does get to the heart of the issue. And whilst I think dying people should be given that choice, in the same way that they're given the choice to have treatment withdrawn, to have the machine turned off, I think they should be given that choice to take control and have the autonomy and the dignity that assisted death will provide.
Well, I think the Honourable Lady has expressed very well her whole purpose for this bill, and in a sense all of these debates we're having about safeguards and protections and process and eligibility are secondary to her purpose, which is to give autonomy to patients. One has to ask what the purpose of these safeguards are, particularly the one that you have to administer the drugs yourself, when in all jurisdictions where physician-assisted suicide is legal, that's the one that people overwhelmingly opt for. I certainly would if I were in that case. So, I think she's right. That's what she's trying to do. She simply wants this bill to go through. I take strong issue with her point that our purpose here is simply to work out, I think she implied, the implementation of this bill. We're looking at each clause line by line to decide whether it is safe or not. The second reading debate was a vote in principle, as she said herself at the time, to continue the discussion. That's what we're doing now. We're examining every bill, every clause closely and minutely to examine whether it's safe. And there is this key distinction between the administration of... I'll give way again.
Just on that point, Chair, it's not an either-or. It's not about passing legislation that improves choice and gives autonomy and dignity to dying people, and indeed fixes the current failings of the law as it stands, and we've discussed those in great detail. It's about providing safeguards that make sure that's done safely and securely and robustly and addresses the issues and the concerns that we're discussing here today. But it's not either or, and I think it's really important to make that distinction.
Danny Kruger.
Thank you. Happy to give way to the Honourable Lady.
Well, one moment. Look.
I know she was intervening.
Order. You can't intervene on an intervention. Let's be absolutely clear about that. The Honourable Lady was intervening on the gentleman who has the floor. If Danny Kruger now wishes to give way to you, he may do so. Danny Kruger.
If the Honourable Lady would like to intervene on me, I'd be happy to take her intervention.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chair.
Juliet Campbell.
I'm going to go back to the amendment, and we're talking about the Mental Capacity Act. The use of the Mental Capacity Act must be drawn into question, as the Act was never intended for legislation such as assisted dying. Much as what's been said in favour of using MCA is that it's tried and tested, people understand it, and to use anything else would make life complicated for professionals who are using it as part of their day-to-day activities of assessing capacity. On the surface, these reasons do seem reasonable, and it's an easy option. However, if the MCA does not meet the threshold of meeting the needs of everyone, then convenience should not be the deciding factor. Convenience cannot be considered as a sufficient reason to use MCA as a fundamental element of this bill. The assisted dying bill in itself is enough reason to have an alternative measure to determine an individual's eligibility to be considered to have assisted dying.
Order. I really am going to have to... I was trying not to, but I really am going to have to draw... Order. I really am going to have to draw the Honourable Lady to order. An intervention is an intervention. We have slightly more flexibility in committee than we do on the floor of the House, I accept that. But the Honourable Lady, and indeed all honourable members, have to understand that speeches are speeches and interventions are interventions. Now, that said, it is the job of the Chair to make absolutely certain that every member has the right and the opportunity to speak. So if the Honourable Lady wishes to make a speech, that is entirely within her right. All she has to do is indicate to the Chair that she'd like to be called, and she will get called. Danny Kruger.
I'm very grateful, and I do thank the Honourable Lady. I think those points are absolutely right. The fact is that even if the House concludes that the overall principle is right, as the Honourable Lady for Spend Valley was suggesting, if it's not possible to do it safely, we should not be doing it at all. And my great concern about proceeding with the use of the Mental Capacity Act as it currently stands in the bill means that the bill will be dangerous. And I just conclude my point about the difference between assisted dying and withdrawing treatment with this, Sir Roger. To decline treatment is to assent to nature. It is to let your body do what it will. To commit suicide is to contradict nature, to do something to your body that interrupts its own plans. And I recognise that the outcome is the same, it's death, but we are considering the process of decision-making in this clause, and that decision is fundamentally different. So, if we want to do this, Sir Roger, if we want to proceed to have an assisted dying law, let's do it properly, with a bespoke ability test that's appropriate to the novelty of assisted dying, builds on the principles of the Mental Capacity Act that we all greatly respect, actually simplifies it, sets out very clearly what an ability test would be, and it would, as I say, be appropriate to this new step that we're taking. We need a new standalone definition, as the Royal College of Psychiatrists have argued. And I recognise, I think the Honourable Lady would accept that we've been forced into this entirely suboptimal step of proposing this amendment and new clause 1 as an alternative approach and giving the power to the government to define the terms at the later stage. The fact is we are confronting the inadequacies of this process when the policy making and the exploration that should have been done at the outset is having to be done as we go through the bill. I deeply regret that, but I hope the House, the committee, will agree that it's a simple and a better step to agree to a bespoke ability test rather than relying on the Mental Capacity Act, which, as the Honourable Lady said, was never designed for this purpose. Thank you.
It might be helpful if for the committee to know that I was bequeathed a list by Mrs McVeigh. I understand that those wishing to speak at the moment are Naz Shah, Minister, the promoter of the bill, Kim Leadbeater, and then I shall call the promoter of the amendment, Sarah Olney, to wind up the debate. If anybody else wishes to speak, please indicate in the normal fashion by rising. Does the Honourable Lady wish to speak? Not now. I'm just seeking. I'll call you if you wish to speak. I need to know that you want to speak. So if at the right time you stand up, that'll be fine. Please be aware that once I've called the mover of the amendment to wind up, there will be no further debate on the subject. That really will be the end of the debate. So we'll now move on to Naz Shah, please.
Thank you, Roger. The key word here in all of this, in these clauses, and I rise to support the Honourable Member for Richmond Park and her amendment, is capacity. And there's much debate being had around the Mental Capacity Act. And I'm going to go back to the evidence which we've heard, and the written evidence and the submissions that we've had in relation to this clause and these amendments. And the psychiatrists who have advised are against it. And I appreciate and I recognise the interventions, particularly from the member for Penistone and the member for Bexley Heath, who spoke very eloquently from your experience in terms of the word itself of ability. And I recognise that. And we've not had the ability to test that concept of ability in this.
Well, the Honourable Lady give way. I appreciate her bringing up that point, and I think it's... Thank you, Chair. And I think it's important to note that in all of the Commonwealth jurisdictions which use assisted dying, mental capacity is the concept that they use. So not only are we basing the utility of the Mental Capacity Act on 20 years of the courts dealing with that, medics dealing with that, we're also basing it on the learning of other jurisdictions which have put this in place. The concept of ability, however, has no base in law.
Thank the Honourable Member for her intervention. I absolutely concur that we are testing this in regards to other jurisdictions. What I might add in response to her intervention is when it comes to just in Oregon in itself, there is not just the assessment of the capacity, there is also, there is a referral to a counsellor in Oregon in particular. Now, when it comes to capacity, we've had lots and lots of evidence, and I'm just going to go back to some of the key points that were made by people. One was the Royal College of Psychiatrists, who stated explicitly, verbatim, not sufficient for the purposes of this bill. And the same Royal College of Psychiatrists, when explaining it, said assessing for capacity to end one's life is entirely different to assessing for the capacity of deciding treatment. 3 psychiatrists who gave evidence to the committee, Professor Alan Howes, Dr. Annabel Price and Professor Gary Owen, all of them expressed doubts about the use of Mental Capacity Act to assess whether a person was in a fit state of mind to undertake assisted dying. Professor Alan Howes said, and it's really important in his evidence to the committee, which I think is worth quoting, Asked about why some people might choose assisted dying, he said they were vulnerable. When further asked what he meant by this, he said this in several sentences, but I think this is the one I'm going to quote is, "They are not people asserting autonomy and pleasure in their ability to make a choice. They are people describing to you things that are negative influences on their life." Moving further, Professor Gareth Owen said specifically, "I have looked at mental capacity a lot in research, and there is no experience of the decision to end one's own life. It is outside of the experience of the Mental Capacity Act, the Court of Protection, the associated research and practitioners on the ground. The reference to the Mental Capacity Act in Clause 3 puts you into an area where there is no experience of central capacity question under consideration. It is very important that Parliament be clear-eyed about that." Professor Owen.
Give way?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Tindall.
Just picking up her point about being clear-eyed, I think it's important that we look closely at the drafting of the bill as it stands and the utility of the Mental Capacity Act. And looking at that closely, it's clear that there are 8 occasions when a person who might seek assistance can formally consider their decision-making. So the Mental Capacity Act would come into play at each of those stages. And so this is not just a one-off lone decision about whether they wish to seek assistance where they do have a terminal illness. This is a decision at each stage, and that happens 8 times in the process, giving a variety of opportunity to ensure that that decision-making and that consent is continued and ongoing.
Nurse Sharp.
Thank the Honourable Member for her intervention. I recognise there are 8 occasions, but there are other occasions, and I will be coming to them in further clauses where it concerns coercion and manipulation, etc., which also apply to the issue of capacity, also in the bill, in numerous occasions.
I thank you for giving way. I think a very good point has been made about the Mental Capacity Act being looked at different times through the process. But I think the question we have to ask ourselves today is it doesn't matter how many times a bad process is applied. If it is a bad process and not sufficient and doesn't have a high enough safeguard, then it is never going to give the right answer at the different times. So I think we need to make sure that we have the right test. And yes, it's absolutely right that we apply it at multiple times, but we do need to consider the quality of what we're applying in the first instance. Would the Honourable Member agree with me?
I thank the Honourable Member for her intervention. I completely agree. As I was saying, Professor Owen also said, "I have had over 20 years of research interest in mental capacity, and but the other important thing to understand is that these are very novel. We are in uncharted territory with respect to mental capacity, which is very much at the hub of the bill." And it is the hub of the bill. Whilst I am certainly like my honourable friend, I am no doctor, whilst I have an experience in the NHS, what I do know is what we don't have around this committee table are experts on psychiatry and experts on capacity. The people that... Happy to give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable lady giving way. A point was made earlier by the member for Solihull West and Shirley about public confidence in this bill. And one thing I take from the evidence that we heard over the week of oral evidence was from the Royal College of Psychiatry, who I would just remind people we nearly didn't hear from. There was a vote held about whether it was added later. They made very clear they have severe doubts about the Mental Capacity Act and in terms of this bill. Does she share those concerns raised by the Royal College of Psychiatrists?
Nurse Sharp.
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention. I absolutely share those concerns, which is why I pushed it to a vote in the first instance. But I am grateful for the lead member and the sponsor of the bill to have had the Royal College of Psychiatrists to give evidence, as I have explained that to her. Coming back to it, the Royal College of Psychiatrists have said that the mental capacity is not sufficient for the purpose of this bill. And in oral evidence, Professor Jamila Hussain, an expert in palliative care and in health inequalities, highlighted how there is an inequity of assessment using the Mental Capacity Act. She said that she does not think the Mental Capacity Act and safeguarding training are fit for purpose. Dr. Hussain went on to say, for something like assisted dying, we need a higher bar. We need to reduce the variability in practice. In relation to the honourable member who mentioned the issue of it being repeated 8 times in the bill, I just want to bring us back to the issue of capacity in relation to coercion. And one of the things that, bear with me, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, again, in any assessment of capacity, we must also consider whether a person is making the request because they consider that they are a burden or because they do not consider that they have access to effective treatments or good quality palliative care. At a population level, palliative care, social care and mental health services provisions may impact the demands for assisted dying service. And whilst I appreciate, Chair, we will be debating this in greater detail further on with different clauses in relation to coercion, but this point in particular relates particularly to the issue of capacity. In her evidence to the committee, Chelsea Roth, a specialist in eating disorders, said the following: "One thing I would like to highlight in our study is that all 60 people who died by assisted dying after suffering anorexia, young women mostly, were found to have had mental capacity to make the decision to end their life. So I worry that mental capacity will not be an effective safeguard to prevent people with eating disorders from qualifying under the bill." Chelsea Roth also said the following in evidence: I also note that in Oregon and California, where I am from and where we have found cases of anorexic women choosing assisted dying, have an additional safeguard to mental capacity. That is, if there are any indication that the person might have a mental disorder, that the person must be referred for a mental health assessment. Have to give way.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. I completely agree with the point that she's trying to make in terms of the issue of mental capacity applying to eating disorders. But would this not be better argued and debated under the point of defining an eating disorder as a terminal illness rather than in regards to mental capacity? Thank you.
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention. I think it's absolutely important that I will be speaking to it in relation to terminal illness, because that's to my own amendment in another grouping. But I think the reason why I'm making this point now is because that also impacts on capacity. We know that when we're assessing capacity, and again it talks to the point, the truth is nobody in this bill committee or otherwise can tell me that this act has been applied to this question. Would you like assisted dying? Happy to give way.
Dr. Simon.
First of all, it's impossible to argue that because we've never been able to have assisted dying in this country. So first of all, that's a spurious argument. But can I say, I don't quite understand the argument here. What you're suggesting is a trident... what the Honourable Lady is suggesting is that a tried and tested system over the last 20 years, which has been tested in court and by clinicians throughout the country, is not preferable to a new system that is completely untried. I thought this committee was about making this safe for patients, and I can't see how this amendment makes it more safe. Thank you.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention, and he actually speaks to my point. And the idea that it's been tried and tested, when we're talking about coercion, when we're talking about capacity in relation to coercion, and I come back to the point, we in this House have only just in 2015 and in 2021 made legislation using the word coercion. It was not recognised. So the idea that this has been tried and tested for the last 20 years, I simply beg to differ from him. It's not an agreement I can share. And the reason I don't share that, because coercion does come into the issue of capacity. The bill that we are looking at, the Mental Health Capacity Act, made in 2005, 20 years old, these conversations weren't being had in Parliament at the time. The vocabulary wasn't talking to coercion. The vocabulary wasn't talking about undue influence, even in this House at the time the Mental Capacity Act was brought and passed in this House. So again, it speaks to my point that are we really saying that we want to try and test something the Mental Capacity Act on something that has, it's never been done before. Happy to give way then after.
Just about.
I'm very grateful to... I'm just trying to understand the Honourable Lady's argument, Chair, and the differentiation between a person choosing to ask their doctor to turn off a life support machine, for example, and then the administrator, and then offering drugs for them to self-administer. Now, I understand in terms of public policy there are differences. I understand for some morally there are differences. But in terms of the capacity, the decision as to whether that person can make that decision themselves, why is it different?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman, and I think the Honourable Member opposite answered that question eloquently earlier, in terms of it's not the same, as much as the outcome is the same, you're asking two different questions. The question isn't to turn off and unplug a machine, it is whether you will take drugs to end your life.
Will the Honourable Lady give way?
So can I just take this in gentleman's interest? Happy to take it.
I'm very grateful for my honourable friend giving way. And look, just following this basic premise of your argument here, I guess, and I'm pleased... You're not the Chair's argument, as my honourable friend's argument, I do apologise to Roger. To follow the basic premise of the argument being made here is, on one hand, my honourable friend is saying that the Mental Capacity Act as it stands is not tried and tested for what we're about to discuss here today. But then by very definition, neither is this amendment. If anything, this is even worse, because actually words such as ability has been discussed here today has absolutely no basis, as admitted by my honourable member opposite there. So, in fact, any amendment that's put forward today, my honourable friend isn't going to agree with on that basic premise, because there's nothing that will satisfy my honourable friend, because all the other amendments on top of this aren't tried and tested in themselves. Would that be correct?
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention. And he's not wrong insofar as you can have two truths here. There is a truth for me that I feel the Mental Capacity Act doesn't deliver what we need it to deliver, because that is a concern of people, the evidence that we've heard. We haven't talked about the conversation, the word ability. It's not set in law, as members have pointed out. So there is a conversation to be had, which again speaks to and as the Honourable Member, the mover of the bill, the sponsor of the bill, the Honourable Member for Batley and Spen, has clearly said and stated this is about strengthening something and bringing the best bill to Parliament to be able to give people the choice. That's what this is. Happy to give way.
She's making such an important speech, and I'm very grateful to her, and I think this is a crucial discussion. The Honourable Gentleman suggested that this amendment would make things worse because it would be applying a new test to it. No, I respect that. He's suggesting that there would be a new test, but it's for a new situation. And I just wanted to alert the committee to the purpose behind this amendment. I understand we're in a slightly polarised discussion here. The Honourable Lady and I both voted against the bill at second reading, and I don't think it's likely that we'll ever support this bill. Nevertheless, I do want to encourage members to consider whether actually this amendment, which has been proposed by the Honourable Lady for Richmond Park, who is not in principle opposed to assisted dying, as I understand it, she is genuinely trying to ensure that this bill is safer than as safe as it possibly could be. And all that's being proposed, as the Honourable Lady suggests, is a strengthening, a recognition of the importance of the principles of the Mental Capacity Act, without the confusion.
Order. There's a division on the floor of the House. The committee will be suspended for 15 minutes, with a further 10 minutes for each division if there is a further division. Mr. Kruger was in the middle of an intervention on Naz Shah.
Thank you, Sir Roger. I'll conclude my intervention very quickly. Can I first quickly say, though, I feel I might have mischaracterised the Honourable Lady for Bradford West when I said that she was in principle opposed to the bill. I don't think, in fact, that's the case. I'm not sure what this distinction between in principle and opposed in detail is, but I recognise that in the case of the Honourable Lady, she certainly is not opposed in principle to the bill, and I apologise to her. Just to conclude my intervention, I wonder if she agrees with me. The whole point is we are taking with this bill a great leap in the dark by legalising assisted dying. At the moment, that leap lands on the uneven ground of the Mental Capacity Act. Surely, if we want to do this properly, let us prepare a solid, cushioned, safe landing space for this bill that's appropriate to it, rather than using the inappropriate mess that the Mental Capacity Act would induce in this case. So she agrees.
No, Sean.
Thank you. I thank the honourable member for his correction, and I'm grateful for it, and I also thank the honourable member for his intervention. Just to clarify, point of principle is I think it's important to say I don't think there's anybody in this House who in principle does not agree with the idea of not letting people suffer. And I'm very much of that principle, and I came to this bill very much in that spirit. And when asked to join this bill committee, it was something I had to sleep on. I realise now why. But thank you. Further on to the interventions from Rother Valley, the member for Rother Valley, and I'm grateful for his intervention, and the member for Ipswich. There's a couple of things that I think it's important for us to understand. But the Mental Capacity Act hasn't been tried in any of the jurisdictions, so we can't make a comparable to any of the jurisdictions across the world which we are basing this law on. That's the first thing. If there is, and again, coming to that issue of is it either or? Is it the Mental Capacity Act? Is it the word capability or ability, rather? That's for the Secretary of State has the capacity and has the power to change that. And surely, if we are being true to the spirit in which we've come to this debate, to make this bill as safe as possible, and we have had so many psychiatrists, so many experts saying that they are not convinced that the Mental Capacity Act is fit for purpose in this regard. I'll just finish my point. In this regard, then surely it's incumbent and it's absolutely proper for us to be making that case during this procedure, during this process. I'm happy to give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. And I just want to really specifically touch on, because I think the thing I was challenging was the premise that because the Mental Capacity Act, in my honourable friend's words, was not tried and tested, that was the premise of my question, then going to a concept which certainly isn't tried and tested in any, either in this country or indeed any other country, surely by that basic premise, if my honourable friend is saying, I can't support the Mental Capacity Act in its current form because it's not tried and tested, well, the alternative that's put together here, and presumably my honourable friend won't support this amendment or indeed any other amendments because they also are not tried and tested, basically following that central argument.
No, Sean.
I thank the honourable member. This clause is an attempt to have that conversation. This clause, by understanding, is to strengthen these very concepts that we're debating, and that's the whole point of this bill committee. And it's like the honourable member for Batley and Spence said, there's no point in having the witnesses if we're not going to listen to what they're saying. This is what the witnesses are saying, and I absolutely take his point, and it makes a very, very valid one. By that definition, would I support this? Actually, I support this because it's led to a debate which we've had for all of the morning, and we're carrying on into the afternoon. So I do support it because I think we're not, as it is, this bill does not give me the confidence, whether it be the Mental Capacity Act, whether it be a definition of ability. At the moment, I feel that this needs to go much further in terms of the Secretary of State, whether that's another amendment being tabled at a later point. Yes, I have to give way.
Thank you for giving away. We had many oral evidences from experts, many psychiatrists, including Royal College of Psychiatry, saying that Mental Capacity Act is not fit for this bill. Even if we are using this act, many conditions like depression, delirium, or effect of some medication can impact on people's decision-making. And it's more worrying when someone with extensive experience in the Mental Capacity Act, who's been training medical students and nurses, Dr. Rachel Clark, saying that often the case that they are poorly conducted, this Mental Capacity Act. So would my honourable friend agree that rather than Mental Capacity Act, the ability, as our honourable friend making this amendment, would be more suitable and safer if we make this amendment to happen?
Nasha.
Thank you, and I thank the honourable member, and I know that he comes from a huge background of mental health and work in his capacity as a professional in this area. And I absolutely agree that we do need to strengthen this. We need to strengthen this bill, which is why I will be supporting this amendment. I do feel that it does strengthen it, because the Secretary of State can make some interventions.
I'm grateful to the lady. Thank you, sorry. I just want to clarify what the Royal College of Psychiatrists actually said. I realise that she's relying a lot upon that evidence. In an exchange with me in their oral evidence, the doctor from that Royal College said that if I were to equate the decision to refuse treatment with the decision to request a hastening of my death in extremis, if I was to equate those two as qualitatively the same and of the same seriousness and outcome, then she said the Mental Capacity Act may well be appropriate for the decision. But the difference was informational, that we would be relying on the notion of informed consent, and that would therefore rely on the information the person was being given about the consequences of that decision and what would. And we will be debating later in the bill the information that is given to that person to form that decision. But I don't think it's quite the case that the psychiatrist said that it could not be or was not fit for purpose. Actually, what they said is it may well be if you equate those two decisions, and many of us do.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. I know he speaks from a huge amount of experience, and I'm very new to the subject, but what I do know is what the evidence from the psychiatrist, it was never a may well be, it was very, very certain. The language that they used, and I referred to it earlier, was very, very clear. It is not a good standard. Furthermore, the language they used was, we are in uncharted territory with respect to mental capacity, which is very much at the hub of this, the bill. There is an equity in assessment using the Mental Health Capacity Act. There were other categorical statements. There weren't a maybe. There was no maybe in there. So for me, it's not about, and if I just make my point, that it's not, for me, a maybe doesn't cut it for this capacity, this level of the test is much higher for me, and the test should be higher for this, to take the option of assisted death. But if I can, I'll give you where and I'll come to.
Sir Roger, if I may. So, if the Honourable Lady wants to go to column 277 of Hansard, when we did the oral evidence, what the Dr. Price said is, she said, you are equating a refusal of treatment in capacity terms to hastening death by assisted dying. If these two things are equated in terms of gravity and the quality of decision, the Mental Capacity Act may well be sufficient. But there are differences. There are differences in the information that the person would need and what they would need to understand. Right? That's clear what she said on the record. And to be honest with you, it was part of the questioning was prompted by me and by my honourable friend, was because we became a little confused, because the whole practice of psychiatry at the moment in the UK is founded on this act. And she seemed to be implying that somehow the entire practice of psychiatry in the UK was somehow on unstable ground, and I don't think anybody is claiming that.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Can I take that intervention and come back and address both of them?
I'm grateful. I think it's very interesting that my honourable friend has cited that, and I'll have a look at the Hansard. But what I just heard him say, actually, quoting the doctor from the Royal College, was that if we equate the gravity of the two cases, then it will be appropriate. Well, that's equivalent to saying, if the two cases are the same, then the mechanism can be the same. But crucially, I don't believe that the Royal College does equate the gravity of the two cases, and I quote from their written evidence to us. They said that, a person's capacity to decide treatment can be reliably assessed. An assessment of a person's mental capacity to decide to end their own life is an entirely different and a more complex determination, requiring a higher level of understanding. So the fact is they regard these two cases to be different in principle, and therefore requiring a different test.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. I think that does respond to some of the points that the Honourable Member has made. But moving forward, I would also say we've heard a lot about the equivalence, if you like, of ending the decisions. And again, it was mentioned earlier of somebody pulling the plug because they decided they wanted to end didn't want any treatment anymore. That is in very, very few cases. By definition, when people are at the end of life, from my experience, having worked in the NHS and with disabled people, sometimes those cases do end up in court. And they end up in court because of there is a difference of opinion, be it medical between the family, be it to do with capacity, whatever the issue is, they end up in the court, and I will give way. They end up in a court in front of a judge. We're removing that. That wasn't my understanding is the Honourable Member, the sponsor of a bill, is removing the need for the judge and is proposing a panel, which is what I read in The Guardian earlier. But I'm happy to give way.
Dr. Neil Shafi.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady giving way. I just wonder whether she can help me with an area that I'm conflicted by in terms of her argument. I've heard the points made by my right honourable friend, the member for East Wiltshire, that drawing the distinction between those who refuse treatment for a condition that is then terminal and actively assisting help with ending their life. But there's a third group. There's a third group who choose to refuse food and nutrition. Now, that is not a treatment in the conventional sense to combat a disease process. That is normal sustenance that would keep you alive. How does she feel, given the application of the MCA applies to that decision and the ability to refuse on that basis, how does that interplay with the amendment as proposed?
That's shut.
So I've tabled an amendment in the next bunch of clauses which will talk specifically to that, and that is, now at the moment the word only needs to be removed because as it stands, somebody, and we've seen this in Oregon, and we've seen this from and I won't go over it again because I will be repeating it later, we've heard in the evidence that 60 women did die and they were assessed to have capacity because they had anorexia. Yeah, happy to give way.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. In terms of those numbers, it is important to be really clear that the vast majority of those circumstances were in the Netherlands, in Holland, in other jurisdictions which have got a much broader set of eligibility criteria to the bill that's proposed. And we're talking a very, very small number of cases in jurisdictions with a similar set of criteria to this. And I do think it's important to make that point.
And my understanding was from, thank you, Chair, thank you for the intervention. My understanding was this was from Chelsea Roth's intervention, and that was specifically from places like Oregon and California. So I'm happy to revisit that. But coming back to the point, I will be talking about us not having, as making sure that people with a eating condition or anorexia, a mental health condition, all of those will be excluded from this, and that will be my second amendment. I don't know if that answers the question or not, because he looks to you.
Give way, and it may well have been a way that I phrased it, Sir Roger. The point I was seeking to make was that the Mental Capacity Act, as it currently operates, can be used for those patients who choose to refuse food and water. My understanding is that, or my view would be that that is a distinct group of people who are refusing active treatment. Given the Honourable Lady's objection and distinction between those who refuse treatment in the conventional sense and are seeking assisted dying, and saying for the latter group the MCA is not the appropriate mechanism, is she saying that for that group of individuals who refuse food and water, effectively choosing to end their life through starvation, the MCA is not an appropriate mechanism to assess their capacity?
My understanding is that, thank you for the intervention, but we're not here legislating on anorexia. We're here legislating on assisted death, the option of assisted death. So I'm trying to understand where he's going with that argument, and it just really genuinely doesn't make sense to me. But I'm happy to take an intervention.
But I think what the Honourable Gentleman is saying, this is not about people with eating disorders or anorexia. It's people who are terminally ill who just stop eating and drinking. And they do that as a course of action to essentially end their own lives. And it does happen on a fairly regular basis. And we've had testimonies from families who have watched loved ones essentially starve themselves to death. So it's different to having an eating disorder or being anorexic.
Nasha.
So I thank the Honourable Lady. My understanding when it concerns eating disorders, anorexia, let me get this right, you're trying to equate NC1 with New Clause 1 with that condition. You're not. Happy to give way.
Maybe give way. Thank you very much for allowing me to give way. I think one of the points that I think is being made here is the difference between something that's active and something that's passive. So I think someone that chooses to not take that next level of chemotherapy because they've had enough, they've gone through a lot of it, it was painful, chooses, in the example you've just given, around to not eat and drink, that is one piece, but I think that's very different to someone choosing to end their own life, and that is a more active, it requires an active participation, it involves other people too. So I think that would be the key difference, and I wonder if my honourable friend agrees with me.
I agree. I thank the Honourable Lady for intervention. I do agree. I just want to push back on the idea that it happens fairly regularly. I would be interested, I'd welcome the Honourable Member, the mover of a bill, to give us the evidence of where it says where there is, because that's not what my recollection of the evidence so far that we've gone through. And I appreciate we haven't gone through all of it. There might be more that we haven't seen as yet. But coming back to the point, it's, yeah, happy to give way.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I thought I would make some clarification then. Under the Mental Capacity Act, if somebody decides to stop eating and drinking, yes, we will let them to do it until they become unconscious, and then the best interest come in effect, and we will take them into treatment if there is a risk to their lives. So would the lady agree with that? This needs to be clarified.
And I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention. I think what this whole conversation has taught me is that we're not on top of this in terms of the Mental Capacity Act or the conversation around ability. This is why it's so important to have these conversations, and even if it is trying to get to another issue, for me personally, with the evidence I've heard and the amendments that I'll speak to later will be much more clarify some of my positions. But as it is, what I am proposing, and the reason why I will be supporting the amendment, is because the Mental Capacity Act on its own, the bar needs to be the test needs to be much higher when it concerns the issue of choosing assisted dying. And for that reason, I'll be supporting the Honourable Member's amendment. Thank you.
Julie Campbell.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for allowing me to reiterate the importance of a stand-alone approach. The use of the Mental Capacity Act must be drawn into question, as the Act was never intended for legislation such as assisted dying. Much as what has been said in favour of using the Mental Capacity Act is that it's tried and tested, people understand it, and to use anything else would make life complicated for professionals who are using it as part of their day-to-day activities in assessing capacity. On the surface, these reasons do seem reasonable and an easy option. However, if the Mental Capacity Act does not meet the threshold of meeting the needs of everyone, then convenience should not be the deciding factor. Convenience cannot be considered a sufficient reason to use the Mental Capacity Act, as it's a fundamental element of this bill. The assisted dying bill in itself is enough reason to have an alternative or a standalone approach to determine an individual's eligibility to be considered to have an assisted death. Capacity is a complicated issue and cannot be oversimplified for convenience. The MCA may be fit for its current purpose, but is not fit for the purpose of the assisted dying bill. I have spent over 20 years working on the equalities agenda, and one of the things that I have learned, and it's been a consistent shortfall, is that we try to address new challenges with old solutions, rather than trying to meet the needs of the people who we intend to serve. This is the reason why I'll be supporting this amendment. Thank you.
Minister Stephen Kelly.
Thank you very much, Sir Roger, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. As noted earlier, the government remains neutral and my role here is not to offer a government view on the merits of these amendments, but rather to provide a factual explanation of their technical and practical effect to assist the committee in its scrutiny. This group of amendments focuses on the concept of mental capacity. As currently drafted, the bill, in clause 3, states that references to a person having capacity are to be read in accordance with the Mental Capacity Act 2005, with sections 1 to 3 of that act, establishing the principles and criteria for assessing a person's capacity to make decisions. New clause 1, which would replace clause 3, and amendments 34 to 47, collectively introduce the concept of an individual having the ability to make the decision to request assistance to end their life. A person's ability would be determined by whether they can fully understand, use, and weigh the relevant information in accordance with regulations which would be made by the Secretary of State. This is intended to replace the term capacity, which is used in the Mental Capacity Act 2005 and which provides a very specific definition of what it means to lack capacity in relation to a particular decision. A lack of capacity under this framework means that a person must be unable to understand, use and weigh information relevant to the decision, and that this must be directly caused by an impairment of or disturbance in the functioning of the mind or brain. Ability, as drafted, deals only with the use and weight of information.
Sorry, will the Minister give way? Thank you, Sir Roger. Going back to my point this morning, and I'm happy to stand corrected, but nobody has disputed it. Of course, within the Mental Capacity Act and within the Code of Conduct within the Mental Capacity Act, there are these two issues that continue to concern me. The first is that the doctor would have a choice within Chapter 5 of the Code of Guidance whether it's practical and appropriate to consult other people with regard to learning disability, for instance. And also, we haven't discussed Principle 2 in Chapter 2, which says that the doctor has to do everything practical to help a person make the decision for themselves before concluding they have the capacity to do so. And that remains the principal concern for some members, those issues within the Mental Capacity Act which have not been considered for this scenario. So I would like the Minister to address those, that this Act that was written 20 years ago was not written for this scenario.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Minister.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, sir. I think the fundamental position of the government is the view that the Mental Capacity Act as it stands is a known quantity, and it provides the legal base for a whole range of measures and interventions, and the government's view is that it would be an adequate legal base to operationalise this Act, should this Act receive its royal assent. Our position on it goes no further than that. It is simply a matter of fact that there is a piece of legislation that is a known quantity.
I thank the Minister for giving way. And he makes a very important point. I just want to understand, when the government says that when he speaks on behalf of the government saying that this is an adequate, it stands, we haven't had, and maybe it's just because I'm new to the process and I'll be happy to be guided, Chair, but we haven't had an impact assessment. And normally in bills we do have impact assessments before, and the government goes out to consult, have a consultation process. None of that has happened because of the nature of the bill being a private member's bill. And I'm just trying to understand, is that still true, and how does the government come to that conclusion without all of these robust mechanisms which would normally go before a government bill?
Minister.
Well, as I set out from the dispatch box when we had the money resolution, the government will publish an impact assessment before report stage. Given that this is a highly dynamic bill with a whole range of amendments having been tabled, it's not really possible to publish an impact assessment on the basis of a bill which hasn't cleared bill committee. So there's a simple point of sequencing, which is why we're going to publish the impact assessment after the bill committee has been completed.
I'm very glad to hear what he's saying about the government accepting the basis of the Mental Capacity Act, and I think that we should remember that in 2005 it was to bring in, if you like, to widen the availability of autonomy for individuals. And I think that is something that we are discussing here as how to enable autonomy for individuals. I also really welcome what the member for Bradford West said about impact assessments. And I would ask the Minister whether he could commit at this time for an impact assessment specifically for Wales, because the context of health and social care there is very different to that of England.
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Member for that intervention, and we have had a conversation about the need to ensure that the impact assessment has a very clear and specific focus on the impact in Wales. Whether that means a separate impact assessment for Wales, or whether we ensure that the impact assessment that we produce is absolutely clear in terms of the impact that it will have on Wales, I can absolutely assure her it'll be one of those two. I personally am agnostic on which of those it is. I think it's simply a question of what works best in terms of the highly integrated nature of the conversation, because the criminal justice aspects are reserved competence, whilst the health and care are devolved competence. So what's the best way to present that in terms of having a single document or two separate documents? I'm not entirely clear on that, but I have absolutely undertaken to check that with officials, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible on that point. So,
Danny Kruger.
I'm very grateful. I'm very puzzled on two grounds. One is about this impact assessment. I simply don't understand the argument that the government has to wait until the end of the committee stage before it can have a view on the bill and present it for report. The fact is the bill could change again at report stage. Surely, and the impact statement would have to be updated further. Why on earth don't we have an impact assessment that can advise the members of this committee, but also the government itself, on the appropriateness of the measures? Which brings me to my second point of confusion. I simply don't understand what on earth the Minister means when he says that he's neutral on these clauses, and yet he's just given the view from his position that he supports, that he objects to the amendment, that he supports the use of the Mental Capacity Act. So he is basing his view, which I'd understood he wasn't going to express as a neutral member of the committee, on the basis of something. So what's he basing that on? And secondly, how can he express a view when he's supposed to be neutral?
So,
Minister.
On the point of the impact assessment, the government chooses when to bring forward an impact assessment based on the passage of the bill through the House. We've had a number of reports today about a very substantial amendment that may well be brought forward by the Honourable Member for Spen Valley in relation to Clause 12, for example. So it's not possible for the government to conduct and publish an impact assessment when quite significant changes are being made. I'd also point out to him gently that this is not a government bill, it's a private member's bill. It's also worth noting, of course, that it's, I think, unprecedented, as far as I know, to have oral evidence sessions in relation to a private member's bill. So we're already, if you like, in relatively uncharted territory. It's also relatively uncharted territory to have ministers on a bill committee who are neutral because the position of the government is neutral. But that, I think, reflects the fact that this is uncharted territory, and so that is where we stand. I think, to his point about our own positions on the, and I speak also for my honourable friend, the Minister of State for Justice, it's a matter of public record that I supported the bill at second reading. It is also the case that we vote as members of this committee on the basis of our conscience, because this is a matter of conscience. That's why the government is neutral on it, because it's a matter of conscience. It's not a matter that's whipped by the usual channels. And at the same time, we are setting out the position of the government. We are articulating the position of the government. He asks how we come to that position. That is through the usual process of engaging with officials and experts in the field, taking into account all of the considerations that the government needs to take into account in terms of the operationalisation of the bill, and the government then comes to a view, and that is the view that I express when I'm on this committee.
Would the Minister be waiting?
Yes.
Sarah Olney.
Thank you. I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. He said that the government has made its own choice about when to do the impact assessment on this bill. Does he not accept it would have made sense to have done it before the committee stage? And then any evidence that threw up that might give rise to amendments that we could have then tabled during the committee stage, and that would have made it an appropriate time to do that. Then the impact assessment could always have been updated depending upon how the bill was then amended during committee.
I mean, it's an interesting point that the honourable member makes, but the point that I would simply reiterate is that this bill committee is a very dynamic bill committee. I believe that 362 amendments have been tabled, and given the focus of the government on establishing the implementability, the coherence of the statute, the legal dimensions, the complexity of what we're dealing with, the government took the position that it was better to wait for the bill to clear committee stage before producing an impact assessment, because to do otherwise could have been a large amount of second guessing based on some very radical changes that may well come out of the bill committee. And so that's, once again, I reiterate the logic of that sequencing. So on the point about the established legal framework, which clinicians have been applying since 2007, capacity would still be used for other decisions about care and treatment. Turning now to Amendment 202, tabled by the member for Spen Valley upon the advice of the government, this ensures that the assessment of capacity is utilised by the assessing doctor and corrects a typographical error in Clause 9 to ensure an assessment of capacity will apply consistently throughout this bill. As I said earlier, Mr. Chair, how and whether the law on assisted dying should change is a matter for this committee and for Parliament as a whole. However, I hope that these observations are helpful to the committee when considering potential changes put forward. Thank you.
Promoter of the bill, Kim Leadbitter.
Thank you, Sir Roger. I will try and keep my comments brief because I think it's excellent that we've had such a thorough debate on this particular issue, but I am also very conscious of time. I'll do the quick, easy bit first. Amendment 202, an amendment I've moved in my name, as the Minister has just said, is to correct a typographical error in the initial drafting of the bill. Despite the very high level of expertise in the initial drafting of the bill, I think this one managed to sneak through. So it would simply change the word capability to capacity to be consistent with the rest of the bill. If I then come to the amendments 34 to 47 and new clause 1, which would, as we've discussed, replace the concept of capacity based on the Mental Capacity Act with a new concept of ability, I do think this suggestion is coming from a good place with good intention by the Honourable Member for Richmond Park, and I thank her for her positive engagement with the bill. But based on the oral evidence that we received, particularly from the Chief Medical Officer and many other experts, this would seem an unnecessary suggestion when we already have, as has been discussed at length this afternoon, a very well-established piece of legislation which is effective in this regard. The primary purpose of the Mental Capacity Act is to promote and safeguard decision-making within a legal framework. And as the CMO said, and as other colleagues have said, issues around mental capacity are dealt with every day in every hospital up and down the country. Every doctor and nurse above a certain level of seniority should be able to do that normally. This view was supported by Yogi Amin, an expert in court of protection work, human rights and civil liberties, who told us during the oral evidence sessions it's well understood how capacity assessments are done, and it's ingrained. Of course.
I thank her for giving way, and I think we all understand the evidence of the Chief Medical Officer that, and why he and others, including members here, favour or prefer the use of the Mental Capacity Act. It is understood by doctors and it is used every day. But what this debate is fundamentally about is that assisted dying is not done every day. It's not something doctors are used to. And so as somebody who has said that you want the toughest safeguards that there are, I think it's incumbent on you to understand that for those of us who have concerns about the bill, what we're looking at is saying this is unusual, it's a step into the dark. And so the amendment put forward by the member for Richmond Park is about making sure that this is not just what doctors are used to, it is another safeguard to ensure that people are not being exploited. Do you understand that?
Yes, I absolutely.
Does the member understand that?
I do, and I take the Honourable Member's comments on board, and I will come on to address some of those points in my further comments. I think it's firstly establishing, as other colleagues have, the it would seem nonsensical to try and introduce a brand new legislative framework rather than use an existing piece of legislation which has stood the test of time. Indeed, Professor Laura Hoyano, Emeritus Professor of Law at Oxford University, who's worked in civil liberties and human rights and domestic abuse, talks about the fact that it's interesting that a number of members of Parliament who are practising physicians pointed out in the debate that they have to evaluate freedom of decision-making, absence of coercion in many different medical contexts. And she talked about the withdrawal of medical treatment, as others have this afternoon. And it's considered to be a fundamental human right that lies at the heart of medical law, that a patient has personal autonomy to decide what to do with their body and whether or not to accept medical treatment, provided that they have the capacity to do so. Doctors have to make those assessments all the time. So in light of this evidence, it would seem unnecessary to create a whole new legal framework around the new concept of ability. But what I would come on to, Chair, is that while I think the Mental Capacity Act is the correct legal framework to use, I do strongly agree with palliative care doctor Rachel Clark when it comes to additional training around assessing capacity for the purposes of this bill, which I think is the point my honourable friend was making. She strongly encouraged us to give serious consideration to this matter, saying, if there is one thing that I would say to the committee about making the bill as robust and strong and safe as possible, please consider seriously the matter of education and training from day one of medical school and onwards. The CMO also suggested that training around capacity, as has been discussed, may require some slight adjustment. There is an absolute expectation within the Act, for example, that the more serious the decision, the greater level the capacity that someone needs to have. Training should be generic, but it may need some adaptation. I agree. And as I've said, I think one of the best things about this Act is the opportunity it gives us, bless you, to develop gold standard training around end-of-life care, end-of-life conversations, and choice for terminally ill people. And that should include training in assessing capacity specifically for the purposes of this Act, for a decision which is clearly of such a high level of consequence and seriousness.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Of course.
Thank you. And I absolutely accept what my honourable friend says about training, and I know we've separately discussed places in the bill where you could replace the word may for must to make the safeguards stronger. But I come back to the same points I made to the Minister, that within the Mental Capacity Act Code of Practice, and that is what we're going to be relying on, I presume, it does say that you can consult, where it's practical and appropriate, other people for the views of the person's best interest, but it doesn't say must. And for learning disabled adults particularly, that remains a principal concern. And I go back to Chapter 2 of the Code of Practice, where it absolutely says it's important to do everything practical to help a person make a decision for themselves before concluding they lack capacity to do so. Now, I know this isn't my honourable friend's intention, but that is the wording, and that is the wording that would lead a doctor to have to help somebody make this decision. So my question to my honourable friend is, how are we going to overcome this issue?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention, and I think it's a point worth making, and it's something that we can look at through the amendments certainly that he's proposed, and I'm very happy to look at those, as I've already said. But the idea of creating a whole new concept of ability seems wholly unnecessary in the context of this piece of legislation that has stood the test of time, as I say, for over 20 years. Coming back to training, whilst the full details of the training programme that I think would accompany the bill can't be put on the face of the bill, it's something that I've discussed at length with officials in the Department for Health, and I've included amendments to that effect in Amendments 186 and 198, specifically stating that training must include assessing capacity, and also, for that matter, assessing whether a person has been coerced or pressured by any other person. Further comprehensive training will, of course, be included in regulations set out by the Secretary of State, and the Chief Medical Officer is confident that this is the correct way to proceed. Chair, furthermore, in terms of assessing capacity, as well as has been referred to this afternoon, the multiple opportunities there are within the process to assess capacity by a range of professionals, I've also proposed new Clause 8, which would create a duty to consult for the Secretary of State before making regulations relating to training. And within this, there would be a duty to consult not only the Commission for Equality and Human Rights, which I think is very important, but also persons with expertise in matters relating to whether persons have capacity. And also, for that matter, persons with expertise in matters relating to whether persons have been coerced. So in conclusion, Chair,
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. Just going back to the multiple opportunities, my understanding from, in relation to capacity, my understanding from this morning's Guardian is that there's a proposal amendment being placed, and from what the Honourable Member mentioned earlier, I don't know if any of other people have had sight of it, but I certainly haven't. So this potential of a panel instead of having a judge, again, would this, and the reason I ask is because the Honourable Member has just asked a question, and the Honourable Member has responded saying, I'll come back to it. But my concern is we're looking at this clause now. Once we've discussed it, there's no going back to it. So I'm trying to understand when will she come back to it and when will she fix it, at what stage in the process, because if we're going to address it in clause 9 or 8 or whatever, how will that impact on clause 1? How will it address the issues that we're actually debating right now?
I thank the Honourable Lady for intervention. I mean, at the moment, we're addressing the Fitness for Purposes of Mental Capacity Act, but there are other amendments which I think would take on board some of the points the Honourable Members made in terms of particularly people with learning disabilities. I'm very happy to look at those clauses. In terms of the point she made around other amendments to the bill, I wanted to give the committee sight of an amendment which I'm currently working on tabling prior to recess, so they had an opportunity to look at that amendment in great detail. But you're right, that would provide another opportunity for assessment of capacity with the involvement of psychiatrists and social workers who have indeed said that that is their expertise, that is what they excel in, and they feel that they have a valuable role to play in this process. So in conclusion, Chair.
So what stage would those amendments that she would propose, having had that evidence, how would that impact the clause 1 with? Because I just feel like we're not going, if we're making amendments later on in the bill, how will that impact on these amendments that we've discussed this morning, in particular relation to capacity?
Well, clause 1 is very specifically about the Mental Capacity Act, and I think we'll get a chance to vote on that this afternoon. Again, other amendments can be put down ahead of report stage and ahead of third reading, but I think the concept of the Mental Capacity Act being fit for purpose is something which we'll get a chance to vote on this afternoon. There's other things that could be added to the bill which would enhance other aspects of the bill, but I think the point we've discussed this afternoon is the fitness for purpose of the Act, and I think there's different views within the committee, and that's understandable. But I think for me, by using the well-established legal framework of the Mental Capacity Act, then introducing gold standard training, consulting experts in assessing capacity, I don't believe there is a need to develop a whole new framework around the concept of ability, particularly for the points raised by my honourable friend, the member for Penistone and Stocksbridge. Therefore, I will not be supporting these amendments.
To wind up the debate, Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Chair. The member for Solihull used an arresting phrase during his contribution in this morning's session when he said that to abandon the Mental Capacity Act would take us into tiger country, which is a concept that appeals to me greatly. But what I would say to the honourable member and to the other members of this committee is that it's the bill itself that takes us into tiger country. This is unprecedented. This is very much new territory for legislation in this country. That's the tiger country right there. And if we're going to let these tigers out into the wild, we need to make sure that the British public, and particularly the most vulnerable members of it, have the right protections. And that is what this amendment is seeking to achieve. There was not a consensus amongst those who gave oral evidence or indeed written evidence that the Mental Capacity Act was a sufficient safeguard for the purpose for which it is proposed to be used in this bill. And I just want to say how grateful I am to the member for Bexley Heath and Crayford for his contribution in this morning's session, because it really vividly illustrated for all of us how the Mental Capacity Act is used in practice. And I'm particularly grateful to him for his personal reflection. Thank you very much for that. So just to reiterate what this amendment is seeking to achieve. This bill proposes to judge mental capacity in relation to a decision to request assisted dying in relation to the Mental Capacity Act 2005. Now, there are elements of the Mental Capacity Act which are tried and tested and which should be retained in assessments of capacity in relation to this legislation. But as per the written evidence for the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the Mental Capacity Act is not sufficient for the purposes of assisted dying because it cannot distinguish between those who are suffering from a mental disorder and those who are not. So it needs to be adapted for the purposes of this bill. So my proposal, my amendment to substitute capacity for ability, and reserve to the Secretary of State the power to define ability for the purposes of this bill is, to me, a pragmatic response. So the debate within this room today reflects the lack of consensus among experts who gave witness, and that is why I think it is better resolved by those experts giving advice to the Secretary of State, and then that the definition of ability can be expertly decided upon. To the point about the difference between choosing between assisted dying and choosing to end treatment, which I think was a big topic of debate both this morning and this afternoon, it seems to go really to the very heart of the different approaches that people have towards this bill. I support the observation of the member for East Wiltshire that the difference is between dying of the illness itself or dying of the effects of the approved substance as laid out in this bill. And to me, that is a substantial and material difference, and that is why our approach to establishing capacity should reflect that. And also the member for Reigate made an important point during the intervention about the difference between a passive and an active choice. And for me, that very much, again, reflects what I am trying to achieve by adopting this amendment. So this amendment allows us to strengthen the safeguards around the assessment of capacity. Given that there isn't a consensus around whether the Mental Capacity Act is sufficient for the purpose amongst the experts who gave evidence, then the pragmatic step is to allow this amendment create the condition under which a stronger safeguard can be adopted if necessary. Thank you, Chair.
The Honourable Lady has given no indication that she wishes to withdraw her amendment, so I'm going to put it to the committee. Amendment 34 proposed to clause 1 as on the order paper. The question is, the amendment been made? Has many of that opinion say aye? Aye. Contrary, no? No. Division? And lock the doors, please.
Jack Abbott? No. Lewis Atkinson? No. Juliet Campbell? Aye. Bambos Charalambos? No. Daniel Francis? Aye. Tom Gordon? No. Sarah Green? No. Rachel Hopkins?
No.
Surgeon Joseph?
Aye.
Stephen Kinnock?
No.
Danny Kruger?
Aye.
Kim Leadbeater?
No.
Kit Malthouse?
No.
Sarah Olney?
Aye.
Dr. Simon Otha?
No.
Rebecca Paul?
Aye.
Jake Richards?
No.
Sarah Sackman?
No.
Liz Saville-Roberts?
No.
Naz Shah?
Aye.
Dr. Neil Shastri-Hurst?
No.
Dr. Marie Tidball?
No.
Sean Woodcock?
Aye.
The ayes were 8, the noes were 15, so the noes have it. Unlock.
Point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Kruger.
I'm very grateful. I wonder if you can advise. I'm perplexed about the position of the government ministers. It's an absolute pleasure to have them here. Nevertheless, I'm confused by this Jekyll and Hyde character that they seem to have two personalities here in the committee, voting as private members but speaking as ministers. I wonder whether there's any precedent for this in any private member's bill, or indeed any bill. I wonder whether Parliament admits of this split personas that they have. I totally understand the rationale for having government ministers here. I mean, it does make me query this whole concept of this being an entirely private member's bill. I recognise the role of the government in it, but if the government wanted to have ministers present at this committee, there are standing orders that enable law officers to attend the committee in their official capacity, but not to vote, which seems to me the appropriate way that ministers should be represented here. If they want to speak on the appropriateness of particular measures in terms of government policy, in terms of applicability, that's perfectly appropriate. But I don't understand why they're also voting on this amendment in their capacity as private members. I wonder if you can advise.
Happily, that is not a matter for the chair. However, let me make it clear. The two ministers present are members of the committee in their own right as members of Parliament and are therefore permitted to speak and vote. as are all other members of the committee. Were any minister to feel that there was a conflict between their personal view and the view that the government wishes to express, then my understanding is that that would be a matter for discussion between that minister and the government. I'm afraid that more than that, I cannot offer.
Could I respond?
The minister cannot respond, but he can raise further to that point of order if he wishes to do so.
Sorry, further to that point of order, Chair, and I thank the honourable member for his question. Just to take this back to first principles, this is a private member's bill. A bill committee had to be formed. The bill committee was formed in discussions between the member sponsoring the bill and the whips and the House authorities. The principle of formulating the committee was based in large part on the steer that was given by the second reading debate and vote, which delivered a majority of 55 in the House. Therefore, the numerical composition of this committee was based on that majority of 55, broadly speaking. So the member for Spen Valley needed to put a committee together that reflected that, and it was also the position taken that there should be government ministers on the bill committee who had to speak for the government with neutrality. And so it's with those two factors in mind that the bill committee was put together, and those two functions of myself and my honourable friend, the member for Finchley and Golders Green, our two functions reflect those two purposes when the committee was put together.
Again, that is not a point of order that is the matter for the chair. And points of order are not matters for debate. They are points of order.
My apologies, Chair.
That's all right. However, that said, I am minded to refer this to the Clerk of the House for his consideration, because I do think there are issues, and this is no reflection upon the honourable gentleman, either on your honourable gentleman, or indeed upon the committee, but I do think there are issues here that perhaps the Clerk of the House needs to consider in the broader context. No, I'm not taking any further order. I've made my judgment. I'm not taking any further points of order on this subject. If it's a different matter, that it isn't a different matter. I didn't think. No, well, that's fine. So for the moment, we will leave it there. We now come to Amendment 353 to Clause 1, which is in the name of Danny Kruger, and with which it will be convenient to take Amendments 354 to 358.
Point of order, Sir Roger. I'm not sure we voted on Amendment 202.
We don't yet.
Oh, is it not grouped in?
We take that when we get in the order. Yeah. Again, thank you for raising it, because it is important. No, it's all right. It's fine. This is a learning process for a lot of people. We take the amendment that is moved. We then take any further amendments that may be moved if the proposer of that amendment, any member who has proposed it, wishes to move it when it appears in the order in the bill, which in this case is not yet. Danny Kruger.
Thank you very much, Sir Roger. Me again, I'm afraid. I rise to move the amendments in my name which would exclude from eligibility to the bill people who are in prison and who are classified as homeless. And the fact is, in the course of this debate and in the evidence sessions that we had, we've heard it said quite a lot that most people who opt for an assisted death in other countries that have it are advantaged, and they're middle class in our idiom. But the plan, of course, is to offer it to everybody. It would be a universal right. And I've moved these two amendments which address some of the most disadvantaged people in our country. And Sir Roger, I've had a very privileged life myself, but for 20 years I ran for about 10 years as full-time chief executive, and for the other 10 and still now as chairman, a charity working in London prisons. So I've known hundreds of prisoners and ex-offenders, and I still do. And while I firmly believe in criminal justice, and indeed I think we need to be tougher on certain categories of offender, The fact is, I recognise from my personal experience the dignity in all prisoners and the absolute necessity of respecting their dignity. In fact, I once wrote a speech, got a headline, "Hug a Hoodie," for a Conservative leader of yesteryear, making some of these points. So, while I recognise the dignity in all prisoners and the importance of respecting them as, and taking an asset-based view, which is a phrase used earlier, which I agree with, I also recognise their vulnerability. And we can make excuses, and we often do, about the impersonal forces that cause people to commit crime. But crime is in many ways a means of expressing agency, of defying what the criminal feels as an unfair society, showing that you can at least make an impact, do something, or get something that you want. It's actually an expression of a sort of twisted autonomy. And our response as a society, quite rightly, to this expression of autonomy is to take their autonomy away, to deny them freedom, and make them completely subject to the state. And it is no surprise that with their lives in tatters, feeling completely unable to change anything for the better, that so many prisoners self-harm or attempt suicide. And self-harm and suicide are the means to a recovery of agency. It is not one that we endorse, I'm glad to say. Prison staff do everything they can to stop prisoners taking their own lives. And Sir Roger, the fact is suicide is a terrible fact. It's the second leading cause of death in prisons. And self-harm is absolutely rife. There are over 40,000 instances of self-harm in prisons in a single year, which is the equivalent of 1 incident for every 2 prisoners. This is research from the National Audit Office. An ONS study found that the risk of male prisoners dying by suicide was 3.9 times higher than in the general male population. And the case law of our courts and the European Court of Human Rights recognises the special duties that the state has to prevent suicide in prisons. Prisoners are an ageing and a highly vulnerable population with less access to good care. And the fact is that the state is responsible for the delivery of healthcare in prisons. Prisoners are wholly in the care of the state. And so I suggest that, given their vulnerabilities and their dependence on the state, offering assisted dying to prisoners would be fraught with hazard. The risk of things going wrong is just too high. I also, to Amendment 356, with respect to people who are homeless, there have been significant concerns in other countries where assisted dying is legal, that homeless people receive assisted dying. And the Chief Coroner's report last year in Ontario found that people in insecure housing were disproportionately likely to receive assisted dying. And one woman had struggled to, I quote, find a suitable accommodation for her medical needs, while her suffering worsened by loneliness and isolation. And she applied for and received an assisted death. Now, the advocates of this bill stress the sacred principle of autonomy, which I respect. But autonomy is not just in the mind, it's in your circumstances. It's determined by the options before you. And so I challenge people, colleagues, to consider whether someone who is homeless or a prisoner can genuinely be seen to be autonomous enough to make a decision of this kind. For someone who is homeless, or indeed a prisoner, surely it is doubtful that the choice to go for assisted dying can ever be a fully free one. And I just want to conclude with a very, I find, terrifying statistic from Canada that showed about public opinion. Here in the UK, polling shows that only 6% of British adults think that someone should be eligible for assisted dying if they are homeless. I don't place huge weight on polls about assisted dying, but I do cite this one as interesting because it shows the change that occurred. In Canada, where they have had assisted dying for some years now, over a quarter of people agreed that it should be offered to people who are homeless. Indeed, a quarter believed it should be allowed for people who are just poor and want it. I don't believe there's some enormous difference in the culture in Canada and the United Kingdom. I'll give away in one moment. But I think it is significant that currently people think that it would be wrong to offer assisted dying for people who are homeless. 10 years after this law has been introduced in Canada, a quarter of people do. It just indicates that the law is itself a teacher, which is one of my great concerns about this bill. It encourages people to think that certain categories of citizen, that their lives are of less value. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you, Chair. Just on that point around the polling, I'd be interested to know, is that the view of people who have been asked whether they think terminally ill homeless people should have access to assisted dying? or homeless people just for being homeless, which would seem very strange.
She might well be right. I totally take that point. I dare say it is, people who are homeless. I think the question was put, should people simply be able to ask for an assisted dying? Those who are homeless should be able to ask for it. People in this country say no. In Canada, a quarter of people ask the same question, say yes. Because what has happened is the effect of the law is that we've now instituted this principle of an assisted dying being an acceptable choice under any circumstances, which is indeed what I'm afraid happens. So I'll just end with a very powerful quote from Fazilet Hadi, who spoke to us as the, I think, representing disabled people, but she made this very powerful quote in my mind. She said, "This bill is not an abstract exercise. It will land in a society that is rife with inequality." She said, "The society this will land in is a thing that needs to change, not the bill." She thinks we need to change our society before we do anything like introducing assisted dying, and I agree. Thank you.
Member proposed 353 to clause 1 as on the order paper. The question is, the amendment been made? Kit Malthouse.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I should start by recognising that my honourable friend and constituency neighbour has devoted much of his adult life to public service, and he should know that I've always admired him for that, and particularly for his work with the vulnerable and underprivileged in prisons. As he knows, I've spent much of my time in politics working with a similar population, and so I too, like him, understand their particular vulnerabilities. However, I do oppose his amendments, and I hope he will bear with me while I just enumerate why. I do believe there are some definitional problems with the amendments he's proposed, as well as some quite serious moral and ethical problems that compound into a practical difficulty. The first definitional one, just an example to give, is who exactly does he mean by prisoners? Because, as he knows, not all prisoners are the same. Would he seek to deny assisted dying to prisoners on remand, who've yet to be found guilty of a crime but are being held in advance of the criminal justice system? Would he deny assisted dying, which is available to everybody else if the bill goes through, to people who are held in prison, for example, for not paying their council tax or for contempt of court? There are varieties of vulnerability within the criminal justice system, and there are prisoners who are inside for differing lengths of time, and there are prisoners who are in differing institutions. Quite a lot of white-collar criminals go to open prisons, for example. Would he seek to deny them? So to me, if his objective is to protect prisoners, or to protect prisoners, the vulnerable prisoners, the definition that he's using is far too wide, and there are many people who may well find themselves in extremis while they're in prison, who are likely to be released at some point after a short sentence or because of the nature of their sentence, who would therefore have their ability to access assisted dying foreshortened. Similarly, I think when he speaks to homeless people and uses the definition that's in the Act, I think what he actually means is rough sleepers, because the homelessness definition that he's referred to includes people who are staying with friends. It includes people who are moving between homes. It includes people who are likely to become homeless at some point in the future. It's a very wide definition which covers a large number of people, some of whom would not necessarily be classified as vulnerable, may well be assessed as perfectly capable and have the capacity to make this decision. And so, sorry, my first point is that I think in these broad terms that he's chosen, there is a definitional problem.
Well, I accept those points. Nevertheless, the bill itself has broad definitions and large exclusions, people who are, have more than a 6-month prognosis and so on. The bill, I'm afraid, operates in pretty broad brushstrokes in order to try and defend large categories of people. So I think it is appropriate to exclude all people who are currently incarcerated, people who are in prison, whatever the reason or the length of their sentence, until they're released, and then they can start the process if they wish to and if they qualify. And on homelessness, yes, it should be the official definition of homelessness, which basically means in precarious housing. The purpose of the bill is to enable people who have full autonomy to make a decision in their own best interest. People who are living in insecure accommodation, whose lives are in flux, who have experienced extreme precariousness in their lives. I think it is a very legitimate question to ask whether they should meet the appropriate criteria for autonomy that we wish to set out.
Those questions would indeed be asked through the assessment that takes place. And of course, as he knows, and we've had a long discussion about it, the Capacity Act relies to a certain extent on context to assess capacity. But just on his point on prisoners, it may come as a surprise to him, but some people who are held on remand are found innocent and are released from prison. So during the period of their remand, some which might be quite lengthy, they would be denied access to something which they otherwise would have been.
My objection is not on the basis of criminality or innocence or guilt. I'm not denying criminals this right because they're criminals. I'm denying them this what I regard as this dangerous opportunity because they are themselves vulnerable, whether they're there guilty or not, on remand or not. The same precariousness applies, the same vulnerability applies. That's why they should be excluded.
Yes, but the point is, I understand the point the Honourable General is making. However, we are talking about people who do not have much time. We have to remember in all of this debate that we're talking about people who have limited time, who've been diagnosed and their prognosis is 6 months or less. In fact, the experience from overseas is quite a lot of people come to assisted dying beyond 6 months. We're operating on the basis here that suddenly everybody at 6 months decides they're going to apply for it. Quite a lot apply with just days to go, or weeks sometimes. And so time becomes important to them, and so it should be to us. And so I'm concerned, as I say, that the definitions interfere with that. Secondly, there is a distinct moral issue about the denial of services to particular groups of individuals based on their circumstances, and particularly, for example, medical services, which we do not currently do. We don't deny medical services to prisoners because they are prisoners. We believe it is a sign of a civilised society that they access the same health care that everybody else can through our National Health Service, and the same is true of those homeless groups, and that includes allowing them to access the kind of decisions that we've talked about in the previous debate. Decisions about, in a moment, decisions about life-threatening surgery, decisions about the preservation of, or the continuation of their life. And it's certainly the case, as he will know from his work in prisons, that a number of prisons have developed hospice facilities within the prison to deal with these issues, with end-of-life issues. And indeed, those that don't have hospice care work closely with NHS palliative care outside and very often bring in specialists to deal with end-of-life issues within the prison.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I think some incredibly important points have been made, and I think if I could maybe give an example, if we took, for example, someone who was homeless, who may be staying with friends, as you said, and they found themselves terminally ill, they may well have difficulties accessing palliative care simply because of the very nature of the fact that they are homeless in terms of making sure that they get the right treatments. So I think really the point here is that this is about protecting that vulnerable group from choosing assisted dying simply because they are in a precarious, difficult situation, and it seems like the best option in light of, lack of palliative care, their current circumstances. Would you concede that this is what my honourable friend is trying to address with his amendment?
I would certainly concede that, absolutely, I agree, and I think the whole purpose of the safeguards in the bill is to protect those who would be vulnerable and to make sure they're making, they have the capacity to make the decision they want to make, and they're making it for the right reasons. But I think a lot of people would find it unfair and immoral that they were excluded not because of their own sense of themselves and their ability and capacity, but simply because of their circumstances. And as I'm trying to point out to you, those who are homeless in the widest definition of the word, or prisoners in the widest definition of the word, can find their circumstances changing quite significantly within the time frame of 6 months. And given that they have only got 6 months under this bill, us interfering with that and saying, well, you're in, you're out, you're not. I mean, so for example, if somebody, this may seem like a narrow example, but if somebody who is diagnosed as a progressive disease and commits a criminal act and ends up going to prison, and within their time in prison, they reach the 6-month period, are they to be denied assisted dying if it's available to everybody else in the population? To me, that wouldn't seem to be morally right, particularly given that we have a duty, and we do deliver end-of-life services to them within the prison to help them cope with those circumstances. And as the Honourable General will know, there are actually charities which provide end-of-life care in prison as well.
In the circumstances he's describing, the prisoner would be eligible for the compassionate release scheme, and that's what I would hope would happen if it was necessary for the prisoner to be released in order to avail himself of opportunities on the outside. If he's terminally ill, that's what should happen.
Well, so I was actually I'm very pleased to raise it, because I was just about to come on to the practical difficulties that this presents for exactly that reason. So, as he's rightly pointed out, a large number of prisoners, subject to assessment as to the safety of the public, if they contract a terminal disease in prison, as they reach the end of their life, they do qualify for compassionate early release. Often that is just within weeks of their death, naturally, as you would expect. And it is carefully reviewed by prison governors, and in fact I think has to be signed off by the Secretary of State as the final control. The problem with denying them the services while they're in prison means that if they are eventually compassionately released, they may only have a matter of weeks or days to go through what is going to be quite an onerous process to achieve what they want to achieve, to avoid having a horrible death. And I guess, in broad terms, my problem with his amendments is that they effectively have the impact of either denying a service that's available to everybody else, to prisoners and homeless people, because of their circumstances, not because of themselves, or what is assessed of themselves, merely on the basis of what they have become. You are a prisoner, therefore you're out, rather than you're not capable, you are vulnerable. Context-specific assessment means we would deny this to you, which would seem more sensible to me. And in fact, that's what would be achieved through the assessment in the Act. And in particular, that blanket denial threatens to truncate the time available to them if they are released or their circumstances change and they wish to avail themselves of assisted dying. And so I think the two together are the practical problem, the blanket denial of services to those people, and then the moral issue of us differentiating health-related services to them seems to me to present some serious difficulties. There may be some people out there who think that prisoners don't deserve it. Right? And that would be the flip side of the argument. I understand he's not making it. He wants to protect them because they are vulnerable. But to me, that seems like a cruel and unusual punishment for people who are already serving time in prison and from whom we should not deny the same health-related services that everybody else receives. So I'll be opposing such.
Nasha?
Thank you, Chair. I'm speaking to support the amendment, and the reason I'm speaking, I want to support this amendment is a number of issues. I have a huge amount of experience on dealing with women, domestic violence and prison in particular. In fact, the first time I came to this House was to lobby the then Labour Home Secretary to reduce my mother's tariff because she served 14 years in prison. From that experience of when my mother was in prison, I was left homeless, so I have experience of being homeless as well. I also have experience of, whilst I was homeless, attempting suicide on 2 occasions and ending up having my stomach pumped. So I speak from a reasonable amount of experience dealing with this. And from a domestic violence point of view, which is why my mother killed an abusive partner, I also understand the vulnerability, and having been a victim of domestic abuse, I also understand the vulnerabilities when it concerns women in particular, less so men. Like the Honourable Member has done lots of work in his adult life, but from women in particular, the majority of women that end up in prison, and we've seen this from the courts and review, we've seen this time and time again, are victims of domestic abuse, are victims of some kind of abuse, whether it's sexual abuse, domestic abuse, whichever abuse it is. There are lots of women in that position. Majority of our prisons, when it comes to women in particular. Suicide in prisons, generally the suicide rate amongst the population in England and Wales is 11.4 per 100. But when it comes to prisoners, that comes up to 108 per 100,000. That's nearly 10 times as high. And we also know 1/3 of female prisoners in England and Wales are self-harming. We know that from the research. And we know from the Select Committee report, from the last Parliament's Home Affairs Select Committee report on health and English prison system, Standards of health were deteriorated in recent years. Budget reductions, loss of prison officers. The report found that prisons, as a result of staff shortages, crowding, are limiting prison. In fact, we know that the government having to bring forward early release because the prison system is not fit for purpose after the cutbacks of 14 years that we've had. Now, all of this speaks to me about the vulnerability, and I hear the point both honourable gentlemen have made in terms of, yes, people should, in an ideal world, they should absolutely have equal access to healthcare. But the problem is we're not in an ideal world. From my perspective, we have a prison system which is having to have emergency intervention for the last since the Labour Party has come into government, because it's not fit for purpose, and we've had to make those interventions. And from a healthcare perspective, going back to what Dr. Jamila has said and the numerous bits of evidence we've heard about health inequalities, so I know from a place like Bradford West, I know that people from ethnic minority backgrounds have less trust in healthcare services. I know that we don't have equity in healthcare services. I know as an former NHS commissioner that those health inequalities impact upon the quality of life, and it's a postcode lottery. So I'm just thinking about maybe Wakefield Prison, Women's Prison, maybe Armley, which is near to Bradford. I'm not familiar with London prisons, but I'm just imagining the vulnerability of the women at Newhall. I'm imagining the vulnerability of those that are not. Yes, they might have, again, it comes back to that capacity conversation. By some definition, they might actually have capacity. But we've also heard from eminent psychiatrists that when you have a diagnosis, that impacts upon your mental health. And in this instance, we're talking about 6 months, which the Honourable Member has referred to a number of times. In that 6 months, your access to your visitors might not come for another few weeks. You might not even have a member of a family next to you when you get that diagnosis. You could well be innocent. You could well have been a victim of domestic violence and you've ended up in prison because you've killed an abusive partner after years of abuse. You could be in a number of situations. But the one thing I concur with is the amount of vulnerability that is there, in particular for women. And that vulnerability then, for me, speaks to the issue of capacity. It speaks to the issue of coercion. It speaks to the issue of all of the things that we're debating here. And that is why I'm supporting this amendment. I'm supporting this amendment because it protects those that are vulnerable. And in any case, if there was a diagnosis, and prison systems will kick in where people, if they are given less than 6 months to live, they would invoke compassionate grounds of leave or to leave the prison system in any case. But I'd be really, really uncomfortable seeing anybody in prison being given the option without that comfort. It's hard enough, it would be hard enough, and I cannot imagine being in a position of, say, my mum. I can't imagine, I wouldn't dare imagine, I don't think I could handle it. The idea of, A, being taken away from your family, being incarcerated, rightfully or wrongfully, guilty or not guilty, but you're in a place and you're in a system and you're in an institution. And you depending on which category of prison you are, the institutional wraparound, if you like, is very, very different. The interventions are very different, on the stages of the sentence you're in at. So if you're in at stage 1, at Cat A, there's much more strict rules, regulations. Faced with all of that, finding out that you've got 6 months to live. And there's no guarantee that it is 6 months, like you said. There's no guarantee that majority of them, more than 40% of them diagnoses don't turn out to be correct in any case, and they could live longer. What the impact of that person would be, and whether they would be making that decision from a capacity point of view, I'm not sure it would exist. I really struggle, but I'm happy to give it.
She's feeling towards the point I was trying to make, perhaps slightly incoherently. The point is that those people, in my view, their access to this service or not, should be based on assessment as them as themselves, their mental capacity, their particular characteristics, their settled will, just like everybody else will be in the bill. The fact that they are at that point a prisoner does indeed impact on the context in which their capacity is assessed, and that has to be the critical factor. Having a blanket ban on all prisoners, capable or otherwise, seems to me cruel, if I'm honest with you. And we know that prisons at the moment have to assess capacity in difficult circumstances. There are prisoners who just decide to decline food and water, to starve themselves to death. They are assessed as having capacity if that's not the case, and in certain circumstances they are force-fed, where it's deemed that they don't have capacity to take that decision for themselves. And in fact, the reason why prisons have dealt with, have created hospices within the prisons is to deal with exactly these end-of-life decisions. So if we're doing it for kind of, I guess, non-assisted dying, why would we deny them the choice and autonomy, having been assessed as capable of making the decision, to do it within prison? And worse than that, if we're going to release them on compassionate grounds, why would we give them a shorter period to access the service than anybody else?
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way, and I appreciate the where he's coming from on this. I sincerely do. What I would say, that comes back to the heart of the issue, doesn't it, about capacity. When you have an increase of vulnerability, when you have an increase of potential, we heard from the psychiatrist who said very clearly, her name escapes me, she was on the right-hand side, what she said was, she talked about if somebody is told that they would get pain relief, then they would choose an alternative path. And those were similar words, and I will find the reference. But my point being that we don't have equal healthcare access in prisons. Yes, we provide prisoners with healthcare, but it is in no way equitable healthcare. The health inequalities that exist outside of prisons are bad enough. When you get into prisons and you have to access services inside a prison, we haven't got, when we're talking about palliative care is not fit for purpose in our country. It is a postcode lottery. So depending on which, yes, I will give way, depending on which prison you're going to, will determine what kind of access you've got to palliative care. There isn't an equal playing field. Happy to give way.
A simple question. Isn't this depriving people of medical care in this context and in the homeless context? Isn't it simply illegal to do that?
Sorry, do you want me to repeat that?
So isn't it illegal to deprive people who are in prison and deprive homeless people of the same care as the rest of the population receive? So it's just a question to you.
No, absolutely. It would be if you're giving if you're making equitable treatment. But the thing is, if you're applying the test of legality, and this is about pain, we've already seen the amendments being tabled from the Honourable Member in terms of widening the scope from 6 months to 12 months. Where do you draw the line in terms of equitable, in terms of legality? This bill is open to lots of legal challenges. If we want to go down that route, there are plenty of legal challenges. Happy to give way, and I'll come back to you.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. I think there's a fundamental difference in trying to ensure that people have equal access to assisted dying rather than prohibiting a specific group and category. Does the Honourable Member understand that?
Might I just remind the member, I do understand it perfectly well. The idea that you're not giving people assisted dying, that category at the moment, as this bill stands, also includes people who decide to stop eating. It also includes people who decide to stop taking insulin. It also includes people who decide not to go on their dialysis. It includes a whole host of illnesses. That's what it also includes. So this isn't just about, if we're talking about equity in giving, if we're talking about the legal challenges, which the Honourable Member started with, then the legal challenges for this bill are vast as they stand. Give the Honourable Member way, and then I'll come back to the lady.
I was going to point out on the point of legality, of course, a law could be challenged under the ECHR, but Parliament is sovereign. So if Parliament decides to exclude a particular category, we, I'm afraid, in this place have to take this enormous responsibility. We make the law in this country.
I'm happy to take this hit.
I thank you for giving way, and she's listed certain categories of people there, which and again we'll come on to the definition of terminal illness. But I'm very confident, given the definition of terminal illness within the bill, some of those groups of people that she's talked about wouldn't be included in its scope.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. For making the intervention. Can I just ask, where does it specify? I mean, I know we're going to come to this debate later, but there isn't anything that right now gives me the assurances that they will be excluded from, unless there's some amendments that she'll be supporting. At the moment, as it stands, this bill does not exclude. That bill, as it is drafted, would allow somebody, if they decided not to carry on with treatment, if they decided that they didn't want to take their insulin, if they decided they didn't want to take their medication that would lead to their death, that would still apply. But I'm happy to give way to the member to explain how she was going to do that.
I'll take the opportunity just to read from the Act, from the bill, in terms of the definition of terminal illness under the bill is a person has an inevitably progressive illness, disease or medical condition which cannot be reversed by treatment. So the conditions that she's describing can be reversed by treatment and are not inevitably progressive. So we'll come on to that debate in due course, but that definition is quite crucial.
But it's not in it. So I beg to differ on the wording that she just used actually makes my point. What it's saying is that if you cannot reverse it, if you decide, as it stands, if I was an insulin-dependent diabetic, and I have been insulin-dependent diabetic on 3 occasions with my children, I can say if I stopped that insulin, then I would become terminally ill. So in the bill as it stands, I would meet that criteria as it is drafted.
No, if you would allow, I'm afraid you wouldn't. You might describe that condition that cannot be reversed, but it's the inevitably progressiveness that we're talking about. It is not an inevitably progressiveness, illness, disease or medical condition, because it can be treated.
Order. There is a debate upon the definition of terminal illness coming up later on in the bill, and I think it might help us all if we were to move forward to that point as swiftly as possible. Now, Cheryl.
Absolutely. We will come back to that conversation. Coming back to the point. Yes, happy to do so.
I'm grateful for the Honourable Lady Gingway. My honourable friend, the member for Stroud, just in his rebuttal of the honourable member, described assisted dying as medical care. I personally would not regard assisted dying as medical care. Does my honourable friend agree with me?
I'm still having that debate in my head, and I'm not convinced. Here it's about, excuse me, Chair, I'm going to not digress, but I will come back to the point. There is this conversation about, people struggling with the conversation about whether it's treatment, whether it's assisted suicide, whether it's assisted death, and these terms are being bandied about. And I genuinely think, ultimately, we have to use the word suicide because we are amending the Suicide Act. We have to use that word because, yes, whilst I appreciate the context in which the proposal of a bill puts forward, but the truth is that it is about taking one's life. So that is how I'll respond to that. Coming back to the honourable member's proposal of these amendments, the reason I will support these amendments, I have way too much experience of people in vulnerable positions. My lifetime experience of seeing what happens. And I do think there are options when somebody has that diagnosis of terminal illness. The prison systems are set up to be able to give them compassionate leave, to explore other avenues. And once they're outside of that system, they can access that support and have that vulnerability reduced. I'm happy to give way.
Dr. Neil Shastri-Hurst.
I'm grateful for the honourable lady giving way. Can she help me just understand her position? Is it a fundamental disagreement with any prisoner having access to this, or is it a fundamental issue with completing the final act as set out in clause 18 of the bill as proposed whilst a prisoner? So, for example, she touched on early release on compassionate grounds. Under those circumstances, you've got a prisoner who is given a 6-month diagnosis. Their early release may not be until the last couple of weeks of life. Should they be deprived of going through the process and the assessment, albeit not enacting the final act, until they've been released?
I actually think, yes, there should be a deprivation of that, and the reason why is because there are vulnerabilities with that prisoner whilst they are inside a prison. Whether they would get that wraparound care, whether they would be able to, so what they need is not an option of assisted death at that point, and again it speaks to my amendment which I've tabled, which is about making sure that we're not having a conversation in the first 4 weeks in any case, because a diagnosis of terminal illness affects people's mental capacity, mental health. We know that, we've heard that from the psychiatrists. It's common sense. It doesn't take us a genius to work that one out. What we know is people in prison have vulnerabilities, have added vulnerabilities. We know we're having a debate about the issue of capacity, which we've not agreed upon. We've clearly not agreed upon. So for me, it's about if you are putting that person at the centre of what we need to with the person-centred care package, then that needs to be about that person being supported to take away those vulnerabilities, to be able to give them that autonomy and choices of accessing palliative care, accessing medication, accessing all of those things, so they are in a much stronger position to, at that point, making an informed choice. That's what I'm arguing. Yes.
To the Honourable Lady for allowing me to intervene. But can she not see, by supporting the Honourable Gentleman's amendment, she's basically defining all prisoners by de facto as vulnerable, right? Which is not the case. I mean, many are, but both the Honourable Gentleman and I have met a lot of criminals and prisoners in our time, and quite a lot of them are smart, capable people who made a stupid decision and are not vulnerable and deeply regret what they did and go on to live perfectly functional lives. And the point I'm trying to make is that we should be applying to prisoners exactly the same criteria of assessment around capacity, vulnerability, settled will, at the time that they are diagnosed with a terminal disease, as we do to everybody else. Because if we're not going to differentiate between prisoners and prisoners, then in many ways we're dehumanizing the entire population. We're saying you are all vulnerable. That's it. No question, and we're excluding you completely on the basis that you are so. And as my honourable friend said, that's in many ways a sort of fundamental denial of a basic human right.
Well,
that's sharp.
The idea that it's a fundamental denial of a human right isn't quite correct. We're talking about the denial of a potential bill that hasn't come into law, and it's a potential legal position. That's the denial. It's not necessarily human right as yet. Once the bill comes to pass, it will, if it does come to pass, at that point it will become, sorry, if I can just finish my point, at that point it becomes an option that would be denied. What I would say, yes, there are many prisoners, you know, they say prison serves many purposes. One is to reform people, and one is, you know, there'll be many prisoners who actually go in there and have a degree in criminality because they're surrounded by other prisoners who make this, you know, there are people who make choices, like you said. What I am saying is, and I've tabled an amendment to this effect, that in the first 4 weeks, we shouldn't be having the conversation around assisted death in any case. And I'll come back to that amendment I'll speak to it when we come to it. In the meantime, you have an added layer of pressure if you're inside prison. It doesn't mean that everybody from starting position is necessarily vulnerable. I absolutely agree. There may be prisoners who aren't vulnerable, but there is the added pressure of if somebody was homeless, if somebody was in prison, not having that family, not having that security, that would no doubt compound somebody's mental health. Whether that's very slightly, whether that's a large impact, that's for somebody to assess. But as it is, I'm supporting the amendment because I do think, and I will give the honourable gentleman word before I make my closing remark.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. I'm just wondering, I can understand where she's coming from, and I understand the argument that she's putting. I'm just wondering, does she have any other specific examples of where other groups, such as people who are homeless or prisoners, have other rights denied to them? Because that's what I'm struggling with. I can understand the point and case she's making in terms of people being vulnerable. The only one that strikes me is that people who are incarcerated are unable to vote. But outside of that, I can't think of any other instance where people would have any particular right removed from them. So I'm just wondering if she's got any other examples or comparable situations she might be able to help us with.
I don't have any comparable situations. What I would say is this is uncharted territory as well. Yes.
They're denied their liberty. I mean, they're not just denied their vote. They are treated as a single class of people who the state has specific responsibilities for, because it essentially owns them for the time that they're incarcerated, and they have particular protections while they're in there. And they're also denied a whole range of human rights and opportunities that the rest of society can have. It is not inappropriate to treat prisoners as a distinct class of people to whom the state has specific responsibility.
No shot.
I thank the honourable gentleman. Clearly he has much more experience of prisons more recently than I have, thankfully. But yes, in closing, I will be supporting the honourable member's amendment to protect people who are vulnerable in prisons and people who are homeless. Thank you.
Sir John Joseph.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to contribute into this discussion based on my experience as a mental health nurse, worked in the mental health services for 22 years, including managing a medium secure forensic unit that I have worked with many homeless people and people who are detained under Mental Health Act by the criminal justice system as well, into medium secure units who involved in criminal activities. And with my experience, I can categorically say that this group of people are very vulnerable. As my honourable friend said, self-harming and suicidal tendencies are very high among this group of people. So one of the risk assessment we carry out in the mental health system currently is, one of the questions is whether they are homeless. Are they homeless? So basically, that question is asked because of identifying that vulnerability. So the point I want to make is also that it's bringing up the importance of the psychosocial assessment that was highlighted in many of our oral evidences. And if we are looking to bring more safeguard into this bill, I think that's something we should to consider to safeguard this group of people. I also want to make one more point, like the honourable member of North West Hampshire said, that all homeless people are homeless in the same way. Some people choose to sleep rough, and I'm not clear that if somebody who is sleeping rough, and if they are diagnosed with terminal illness, are we looking to bring them back into an NHS bed to assist them to die? I don't know if there is a provision identified. How are we going to manage those sort of situations?
I wasn't saying that necessarily what he said I said about all homeless people is the same, but it is the case that for rough sleepers in particular, a number of charities like St Mungo's and others have had to develop on-street palliative care services for rough sleepers who sadly do contract terminal diseases or reaching the end of their life. And very often part of that service is to try and encourage them to come into some kind of institutional environment like a hospital where their healthcare can be better served. It is a particular difficulty with that group, and there is a very high incidence of mental health problems among the street homeless, not homeless people generally, but the street homeless. But that, in my view, would be caught by the general assessment that takes place. And in fact, you may be interested to know that there is quite a lot of on-street mental health assessment that takes place for people, because people obviously who are living on the street develop all sorts of disorders, and indeed there are often people with quite significant mental health problems on the street, and they are dealt with as closely as possible to the front end. So it would not be beyond the scope, if you like, or not beyond the capability of the state to make assessments that are appropriate to context about individuals. And I think the point I'm trying to stress in my thing is we need to see the person as an individual as well as within their context, and a blanket ban on particular groups The human right I was referring to is that it denies them the right to be seen as an individual, assessed as an individual, which is what we do in every other service that we provide them.
Sergeant Joseph.
Yeah, thank you for that intervention, which helped me to clarify that not all patients who are diagnosed terminally ill, not necessarily bedridden, they may be capable of carrying out their day-to-day activities as normal, even though they were diagnosed with a terminal illness and the prognosis was given for 6 months. They may be still walking around. Not everybody needs a palliative care, in fact. So my question was, if somebody is a rough sleeper who's been diagnosed with a terminal illness and who want to get the help of assisted dying, are we making a provision to bring them back into an NHS bed to facilitate them dying? It would be great if we can make that clarification clear. So, I mean, I want to contribute into this, and I want to support this amendment based on the fact that I have seen many of this group of people who are highly vulnerable and more likely to choose this path to end their life if they were given an option. Thank you.
Minister?
Thank you very much, Chair. These amendments relate to the criteria individuals would need to meet in order to request assistance to die under the bill. All amendments seek to amend the eligibility criteria in some manner. To reiterate, the Government has no view on the policy questions pertaining to these amendments, and my role here today is to offer observations on the legal and practical impact of amendments tabled. The legal impact of these amendments will be the main focus of my remarks. Amendment 353 seeks to make prisoners ineligible for assisted dying services even if they meet the definition of having a terminal illness. Amendments 354 and 355 are consequential amendments to make it a requirement for the coordinating doctor in the first assessment and the court process to ascertain whether a person seeking assistance to end their own life is or is not a prisoner. Aside from the right to liberty, Article 5, the European Convention on Human Rights requires that prisoners should have the same rights as those who are not prisoners. The rights engaged by this amendment are Article 8, right to respect for private and family life, and Article 14, prohibition of discrimination. Making prisoners ineligible for assisted dying would, on the face of it, lead to a difference in treatment between prisoners and non-prisoners, which would need to be objectively and reasonably justified. The justification test requires that the treatment in question is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim.
I noticed that, I thank the Minister for giving way. I know he used the word treatment twice in that context, but we're not talking about a treatment, we're talking about assisted death. So I just wanted to understand that, because I know somebody mentioned it earlier that this is a treatment, and it's not actually treatment, is it? I welcome the clarification on that.
Well, I thank her for that intervention. My understanding is that it is termed as a treatment under the law. But there's, I mean, the government doesn't take a view on the specific semantics of the word, but that is how it's classified under the law, is my understanding.
Sarah Olney.
I think it's really important that we do establish whether this is in fact going to be defined as a treatment or indeed as something quite distinct in law. Certainly my understanding, this is not a treatment, it's not my understanding of the word treatment that it should ever apply to assisted dying, but I'd be grateful for the Minister's clarification.
I apologise, I think I've misunderstood here what both the Honourable Lady for Bradford West's intervention and then my comments were not clear. I meant this is the treatment under the law of this matter. So, as I said, the justification test requires that the treatment in question is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. So that means the way in which the matter is treated under the law. And I apologise. That's what I meant with my initial. I think we got our wires crossed. Finally, let me address amendments 356, 357, and 358. The purposes of these amendments is to exclude those who are homeless within the meaning of Section 175 of the Housing Act 1996 from the definition of terminally ill person. The effect of Amendment 356 would be to amend the definition of a terminally ill person as set out in Clause 1 of the Bill. It would expressly exclude a person who, notwithstanding they met all the other requirements set out in paragraphs A to D of that clause, was homeless within the meaning of section 175 of the Housing Act 1996. Amendments 357 and 358 then make consequential amendments to clauses 7, first doctor's assessment, and 12, court approval. These amendments would require the coordinating doctor and the court to be satisfied that, in their opinion, the person was not homeless within the meaning of section 175 of the Housing Act 1996 before making their statement or declaration to allow the person to proceed to the next stage of the assisted dying process. The rights set out in the ECHR should be secured for everyone without discrimination on any ground, Article 14. This amendment engages Article 8, right to respect for private and family life. Making those who are homeless ineligible for assisted dying would lead to a difference in treatment which would need to be objectively and reasonably justified. The justification test requires that the treatment in question is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. I hope that these observations may be helpful to members in considering these amendments and making a determination about who should be eligible for accessing assisted dying services should the bill pass. Thank you, sir.
Promoter of the bill, wish to comment or not?
No comment.
Danny Kruger to wind up.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, what an interesting debate. I'm very grateful to all honourable members who've participated. Just quickly, interested in what the Minister was saying there about the ECHR, notwithstanding my general points about sovereignty of Parliament. My understanding is, I'd be interested if the Minister disagreed with this, that when Lord Sumption gave evidence to the committee 2 weeks ago, he stressed the wide margin of appreciation that exists under the ECHR that is given to member states. And I wonder whether he doesn't think that that would be applicable in this case to ensure that the British Parliament, which voted to exclude these particular categories of people, couldn't do that. But if his view is that, particularly under Article 14, that the bill could potentially be subject to challenges on discrimination grounds, I think we're going to have a lot of problems throughout the bill in the way that it applies. And I wonder whether, in due course, we'll be able to tease out how the ECHR will intersect with it. But as he says, the crucial point is any discrimination must be justified on the basis of achieving a legitimate and proportionate aim. And my suggestion to him and to the committee is that this absolutely does. There is an absolutely legitimate aim, and this is a proportionate means of doing so. The debate got quite philosophical, which I found very interesting. I just want to quickly observe, in response particularly to my right honourable friend, my neighbour and esteemed colleague, great Conservative, member for North West Hampshire. He seems to have a vision of politics, or particularly of our particular political creed, which is entirely individualistic. He stresses the absolute importance of individual autonomy, treating everybody as an individual without reference to the context in which they live. And I would suggest to him and to the committee that actually our freedom and our autonomy depends on our relationships. Our autonomy proceeds from our socialisation. We don't emerge fully formed into the world with all of our values and attributes. We acquire them by virtue of the people around us. And the crucial thing about the prison experience is that it disrupts the relationships which can make an individual genuinely free. Homelessness does likewise. And what it also does is it sets up all sorts of new relationships, new socialisations, which can often be very negative. And I just want to put this... My honourable friend wants to come in.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his kind words, but he will know that the foundation of his and my beliefs stretches from Magna Carta through to Mill and is based on a legal notion that I am, to a certain extent, my own island, that I have autonomy over myself, and from habeas corpus to making decisions about my own medical treatment, that I should have rights there. That's not to say that my decision-making capacity shouldn't be assessed within the context that, in which I live. And what I was trying to communicate to him and to his supporters of this amendment, that I think it is profoundly wrong to paint all prisoners with the same brush and see them as a homogeneous whole. rather than see them for the individuals they are, when they are taking a very individual, personal and private decision about their own life and death.
Danny Kroger.
Well, I trace our liberties to a evolution of British law and of English law, which actually recognises the essential nature of our individuality as being socialised. We belong to each other, and we derive our freedom from other people, and our autonomy and Magna Carta and all of the liberties of the individual proceed from that. None of us, no man is an island, I would suggest to the right honourable gentleman. And my point, and his point about treating everybody as solitary individuals, making independent private decisions, that isn't the way any of us operate, and it's certainly not the way people in the most vulnerable circumstances operate. What actually happens is that we are heavily influenced by the people around us, by our circumstances, by the choices that are before us. I just want to put, to descend from the abstract, let us consider an actual hypothetical case. You're in prison, you've committed some crime, or you haven't committed some crime, but you've been remanded. You are, your whole family life has been smashed to pieces over the years or just recently. And then you get this terrible diagnosis of a terminal illness. And a doctor says to you, because they're allowed to do so under the bill, you know, one of your options is an assisted death. I think that would be incredibly influential to the point of serious concern for those of us who know how vulnerable people in prison are. And the same applies to people living on the streets, the people he was describing. Happy to.
I'm grateful for the honourable member giving way. I believe what the honourable member has just espoused is the sort of thing that, and it's prompted this amendment, is the sort of thing that would have come out had we had an impact assessment, had Where Does the Government Bill, some sort of consultation that would have flagged up these sort of potential issues ahead of the next reading, and I believe that that's the exercise that he's engaged in. We've been promised a bill with the strongest possible safeguards. Now, he comes from a position similar to mine, that there's no stronger safeguard than preventing people having assisted dying. What he's trying to do in that absence, I believe, and I'm happy to be corrected, is to flag up potential issues that mean more safeguards are needed than are being offered in this bill. Would he be prepared to comment on this?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. He's absolutely right, and once again, it is a shame that we are feeling our way in the absence of that assessment. Nevertheless, I think we all do have experience, and we can draw on the evidence. And the honourable lady, member for Bradford West, made a very, very powerful point. I talked in my opening speech about the evidence of suicide among the male population, but she's absolutely right, and I've got experience of working with women in prison as well. And I'm afraid to say there is a genuine danger of sort of chronic, almost epidemic self-harm among the female prison population. Likewise, suicide. The fact is, and it's a topic that we need to bear in mind throughout this debate, suicide is in fact itself contagious. That's why it's so important to discuss it in a responsible way. So the option, and I do use the term advisedly, the option of assisted suicide is itself, I think, dangerous in the context of a prison population where these ideas are contagious. Right Honourable Gentleman talks about the need to assess each case on its own merits individually. I recognise that, and in principle, of course, that's what we should be doing. Nevertheless, that assumes that the safeguards in the bill are themselves adequate to the challenge of dealing with people in these particularly vulnerable circumstances. I'm concerned that they're not adequate anyway. I'm very conscious, believe very strongly, that they're not appropriate to people in these circumstances, and therefore it is appropriate to have what he calls a blanket ban. And we, as I said in my earlier intervention, we do have to treat particular classes of people in the same way, and we do that specifically all the time with respect to the prison population. The fact is, we have to draw the line somewhere. We're drawing the line in all sorts of places in this bill, around the age limit, around diagnosis and prognosis. I think it is very appropriate, given the extreme vulnerability of these populations, that we draw it around them and protect them from the vulnerabilities and the dangers that I think all members recognise might apply in certain circumstances. They will apply in extreme circumstances. Sorry, in heightened likelihood. In respect to these populations. Now, Sir Roger, I don't propose to push these amendments to a vote, but I hope that I'm grateful to honourable members for the points that they've been making, and I hope that these concerns have been noted. Thank you.
Is it your pleasure the amendment be withdrawn?
Yes.
Aye.
Aye.
Amendment by leave withdrawn. Amendment 356 not moved. Amendment 179 debated earlier. Kim Leadbeater, move formally. Move formally?
Move formally.
The question is that Amendment 179 be made. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. We now come to Amendment 109, with which it will be convenient to take Amendments 110, 111 and 112. Juliet Campbell.
This amendment seeks to strengthen the bill in that it will establish a benchmark for the level of understanding of assisted dying and its process, that the person should be able to demonstrate that they need to demonstrate this to start the process. This will help to ensure that the person requested assisted dying understands what they're asking for and understands the process. This will help ensure that doctors and other professionals can be assured that those who are engaged in the process have come to their own informed choice. Being informed conceptually is meaningless. It adds nothing to the bill unless we can establish that the person is able to demonstrate to healthcare professionals and other people that they understand assisted dying and the processes.
The question is that Amendment 109 to Clause 1, as on the order paper, be made. As many of that opinion... I beg your pardon. Kit Malthouse.
I'm grateful, Sir Roger, and I understand that what the Honourable Lady is trying to achieve. However, I believe her amendments are unnecessary. Demonstrably is a word that is commonly used in British law and effectively is used as a matter of emphasis, that something is demonstrably important, but also used to show that something is proven. And as she will have seen from amendments certainly that I've laid and later in the bill, in the declarations that I'm hoping to amend the bill to produce, I have asked that there are declarations two ways, both by the patient themselves, that they've had the conversation about all their options, they understand their options and what their prognosis is likely to be, and also a declaration by the doctor, the coordinating doctor, that they have similarly had the conversation, that the patient is in full possession of all the facts that they need and that they understand what has been communicated to them. My view is through that and the assessment that the doctor has to go through, that the person has a settled will to do this, is enough for this bill to show that the person demonstrably wants to access the service for themselves. I'm slightly concerned also that this amendment accumulates with other amendments that we're dealing with later that are seeking to insert a series of individual words into the bill that will unnecessarily complicate the contemplation of the bill by doctors. We heard that for the bill to work in evidence, it needs to be simple and understandable by everybody who is in it, is dealing with it. And the more we can minimise words which may be open to interpretation by lawyers, and we've certainly got plenty of lawyers in the room, I think the better. So I'm afraid, Sir Roger, from that point of view, I'll be opposing the amendment, although I understand what the Honourable Lady is trying to achieve, and I believe we've achieved that by different means.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. This group of amendments, in the name of the member for Broxtowe, relate to an individual who seeks to access assisted dying services, demonstrating their wish to end their own life and demonstrating their understanding of the process by which this happens. In order to support the committee's deliberations, I will briefly summarise the government's analysis of the effect of these amendments. Amendments 109, 110 and 111 would modify the existing requirement that the coordinating doctor and the independent doctor must undertake an assessment to ascertain whether, in their opinion, the person has a clear, settled and informed wish to end their own life. This would be amended to require the person to have a clear, settled and demonstrably informed wish. The term demonstrably would not provide further practical guidance beyond the words already in the bill and could create uncertainty as to what constitutes demonstrably informed. I'll now turn to Amendment 112. Clause 9 currently provides that the coordinating and independent doctors must explain and discuss a number of matters with the person being assessed. These matters are set out in Clause 9, subsection 2 paragraphs B, C and D. In the interest of time, I will not go through each of these matters. However, they include an explanation and discussion of the person's diagnosis and prognosis, any treatment available and the likely effect of it, and the further steps that must be taken before assistance can lawfully be provided to the person under the Act. This amendment would add an additional requirement on the coordinating and independent doctors. It would require that they are both satisfied that, in their opinion, the person seeking assistance has demonstrated their understanding of the matters that have been discussed under Clause 9, subsection 2, paragraphs B, C and D, that I have previously referred to. The amendment does not specify in any further detail what the doctors would be required to look for to satisfy themselves that a person has demonstrated their understanding. This would be left to their professional judgment, with training, support and guidance as with other concepts in the bill. The amendment would leave it to the coordinating and independent doctor's professional judgment to determine what demonstrated their understanding looks like in respect of each individual person. I hope, Mr. Chair, that these observations are helpful to members of the committee in considering the bill and amendments put forward by various members. Thank you.
Danny Kruger.
I'm sorry not to have robbed earlier, Mr. Roger, but just a few points. I really do think this amendment, which I very much applaud the Honourable Lady for bringing, genuinely, demonstrably, I might say, strengthens the bill. Can't seem to be in any sense hostile to the principle or the purpose of the bill, but to support it. And I do think, to make a gentle criticism, I think there is a concern throughout the bill about the lack of a proper trail of documentary evidence that follows the applicant through the process. I point out that the two conversations with the doctor take place behind closed doors. No record of their discussion would be made. I don't think that's conducive to trust. There's no way to assess if the safeguards are actually in operation.
I'm afraid, sorry, that's not actually correct. So if he was willing to look at my amendments, which he may not have got to yet, I appreciate. So in that, it does require that the doctor produces a report about their assessment of the patient, and it also obviously requires, as I said, a two-way declaration that the conversation pursuant to clause 4.4 has taken place, and that in the doctor's view the person is in possession of all the facts they need to make the judgment that we're asking them to make. So there is detail and documentation that will be inserted in the bill. Should my amendments pass?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that, and I particularly applaud the aspiration in the first amendment he mentioned around ensuring that the doctor's conversations are properly recorded. The other important necessity... Happy to.
Just on that point, in response to the comment from my honourable friend, all this will obviously be recorded on the patient's medical records as well, so the idea that this isn't being recorded would just not be correct.
Well, Danny Kruger. Well, indeed, decisions will be recorded, but the conversations that the Honourable Lady stipulates to take place in the bill, in my view, need further recording, further evidence of what was discussed in order to ensure that the safeguards have been properly applied. I also point out that there's, in the bill, in clause 34, a review by the Chief Medical Officer. And to do this effectively, the Chief Medical Officer must have evidence available before just a few schedules that have been signed off. Likewise, there is an opportunity, I'm glad to say still, so far as we still have a judicial process, for a legal appeal. And I'm concerned about if there's any lack of documentary evidence, that it's difficult for any external party to review it, or indeed for the Court of Appeal. So currently the High Court judge, considering the application, in my view, has a great paucity of information that he or she is able to request. I think it's important that the High Court judge, or indeed if we move to a panel, should have access to a much fuller range of documentation in order to ensure the process has been properly followed. And for any... yes, I certainly will.
Thank the Honourable Member for giving way. I'm just wondering if the point that he makes, which is a valid one about wanting to make sure that there is documentary evidence, is that not something that he feels would be covered about later on in the bill when we talk about amendments about training, in specific making sure that there is a coherent way in which that all doctors and people performing the process are set out how to go about reporting?
Danny Kruger.
The Honourable Gentleman is a great stickler for doing things in the right order. I'm grateful to him for calling us to order on that point again. I dare say he's absolutely right. This bill is, all these issues are rather interwoven through the bill. So I'll finish with this, Sir Roger, making the point about the role of the Court of Appeal. A rejected application, I'm not sorry to say not an approved application, but a rejected application can be appealed under Clause 12. And for the Court of Appeal's review to be substantive, they surely must be able to review the evidence as full as possible of what happened throughout the terminally ill person's application. Thank you.
Juliet Campbell to wind up the debate.
Thank you, Chair. I still do think the importance of adding the word demonstrably should be included. I don't see that it creates any additional confusion. Later on, my honourable friend has said that he has included some amendments which should make this, which would exclude these. However, that's later on. So putting demonstrably here actually just strengthens what my honourable friend is saying. This.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Does she also share some of my frustrations that when the Minister stands on his feet and says that this is the government's position, that is in absence of an equality impact, an equality assessment, an impact assessment. So whilst I appreciate he's outlined, the government has outlined that the process, if you like, is different, the truth is, in absence of that, where do we find the weight to support those positions?
Campbell.
And I absolutely agree. This is the weight. The word demonstrably produces the weight of this sentence in the bill. It can add to every other part of the bill, but a person must be able to demonstrate to healthcare professionals, to social care professionals, that they understand what assisted dying is and the process that will be gone through as well. They need to be able to demonstrate to other professionals that they understand. A written report by a healthcare professional or a social care professional is not enough. They themselves will have to demonstrate that they have a full and clear understanding.
Does the Honourable Lady wish to press the amendment to a division? Your call.
I won't propose to push it to a vote.
Is it your pleasure that the amendment be withdrawn?
Yes. Aye. Aye.
Amendment by Lee withdrawn. Now I come to
further consideration of this bill be now adjourned.
the question is that this further consideration of this bill be now adjourned. Does many of that opinion say aye? Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Order. Order.